Hello, everybody. Happy Thursday, December 8th, 2022. Without much further ado, rightsforfamilies.wordpress.com. If YouTube takes down everything, and we're going to read Understanding the Great Dred Scott Fraud. Okay. The Dred Scott versus Sanford case of 1857, which is universally considered one of the worst Supreme Court decisions in history, and is often cited as an instigator of the Civil War, is impossible to brief in a reasonable manner unless an approximately 11,000-word tirade disparaging the entire African race is removed from the majority opinion. The tirade, which begins with the sentence, "This is certainly a very serious question," and ends with the paragraph beginning with, "Now, if the removal of which he speaks," expounds upon an outrageous argument presented by defendant John Sanford in a plea in abatement against a claim of jurisdiction, stating that anybody of African descent is not human under the U.S. Constitution and can never be a U.S. citizen, a stance which was not supported by a majority of the population at the time, nor by any of the 8 concurring dissenting opinions. This tirade stands in direct contrast to the writing style and reasonable arguments presented in the rest of the majority opinion penned by Chief Justice Roger B. Taney, and is not directly referenced nor even acknowledged to exist in 7 of 8 concurring dissenting opinions. It is proposed this tirade was inserted by corrupt pro-Congress anti-Supreme Court factions in government, industry, and/or media early in the majority opinion for maximum impact and distraction from the rest of the opinion, just prior to widespread release to undermine the decision of the Supreme Court on the only true controversial issue of the case, that Article 4, Section 3, Clause 2 of the U.S. Constitution does not grant Congress authority to acquire and hold U.S. territories as colonies, deciding the rights and privileges of people living in these territories at will, independent of the rights and privileges granted in the Constitution. In other words, that the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional because Congress deemed that some U.S. citizens living in some territories had the right to own slaves, while other U.S. citizens living in other territories did not have this right. It is proposed the fraudulent opinion was released as Dred Scott versus Sanford with a D, while the real opinion, which is arguably the second best penned majority opinion in the history of the Supreme Court after Marbury versus Madison, was called Dred Scott v. Sanford without the D, the actual name of the defendant. This charade represents one of the greatest frauds in U.S. history committed against the Supreme Court of the United States, for which neither the Supreme Court nor the rest of the country has yet to recover. The fraud not only undermined the power of judicial review that the Supreme Court possesses over acts of Congress. Dred Scott represented only the second time in history the Supreme Court exerted its power of judicial review to strike down an act of Congress as unconstitutional, the first time being the landmark case of Marbury versus Madison. But the charade also undermined an as yet officially recognized power of judicial review the Supreme Court must also inherently possess over the amendment process. This weakening of Supreme Court powers eventually led an emboldened Congress to make significant, detrimental changes to the Constitution when the 16th Amendment was ratified in 1913, whereby Congress granted itself unchecked power to collect unapportioned direct taxes at will against specific provisions in 3 different places in the Constitution restricting this power from Congress. The ability of Congress to collect unapportioned direct taxes at will threw a giant wrench in the system of checks and balances the framers originally set up, and is the main source of dysfunction and corruption in the federal government, i.e. the D.C. swamp we have today. Attempts by President Donald Trump to make America great again by weaning the federal government off of unapportioned direct tax revenues, i.e. income taxes, and instead relying on pre-16th Amendment revenues from indirect taxes such as tariffs and consumption taxes, as originally intended and as originally practiced without a hitch for over 100 years, has led Congress to fight back in unprecedented ways to retain its unconstitutionally self-granted powers of unapportioned direct taxation. Once President Trump completes the process of weaning the country off of the unconstitutional collection of income taxes by the federal government, the Supreme Court, rightfully exerting its full authority of judicial review over the amendment process and striking down the 16th Amendment as unconstitutional, becomes the second important step in reversing over 100 years of government dysfunction and corruption instigated by the Great Dred Scott Fraud of 1857. So the problem is nobody has ever read the case. Nobody reads anything, apparently, because doing these case briefs was my absolute favorite part of law school. I just loved, this was my favorite. I know Harvard, that's all they do is these kind of law reviews, and all they do is copy each other. I mean, they just, whatever. They just copy off of Wikipedia. They whatever. I completely did every one of these on my own, independently, from scratch, and I read through all the lines, and I was just torpedoing all these. I mean, the Supreme Court was so horrible on a lot of stuff. They were so wrong on so many facts on a lot of these cases and things, and the facts were weird. And anyway, so yeah, this is my favorite thing to do. And when I reviewed this, I actually read the case. I wanted to get to the core of what the problem was. Why is this the worst case in history? What was the reasoning? Where did the reasoning fail? And the reasoning didn't fail at all. It was a very well-written case. Once you take out this tirade that didn't make sense, it was like, once you took that out, the reasoning makes sense. And there's a lot of other reasons why it was taken out. But here we go. And I know I need a table of contents and put it in Word format. And they said I didn't have enough references or something. It's like I don't know what you want me to refer to. I'm referring to the Constitution and the actual case. I'm trying to brief a case. So what references do you want? I'm briefing a case, and I have the case brief at the end. And this file at the end is the actual case brief. But you can't brief. It's impossible to brief this case unless you take out this tirade. Try it, everybody. I mean, try it independently. And try actually reading the damn case that you're briefing. Harvard. God. Anyway. Hello, everybody. Happy Friday, December 10th, 2022. This is part 8 of Music of the Night Media Swamp Stock Tutorial. So when you do a case brief, this is a case brief. This is how I did it. You put the name of the case, you put court, judicial history, you put facts, you put issues, holdings, reasoning, and then you put the decision, the concurring dissenting opinions, and then you're done. And that's every case brief in the history of the world. And they're usually a page or two long. A page, two. This one is 8 pages because it's 12 pages long. Oh, I wish it were 11. It's 12 pages long. I'm going to read it right now. Okay, it's the case brief. And here it is. This is the case brief of Dred Scott versus Sanford without the D, because that's his real name. His name is Sanford. Dred Scott versus Sanford. There's its citing, its time, everything. Court. Supreme Court of the United States. This is without, once you can't do this unless the tirade is removed, because it makes no sense. Everything contradicts each other. If I were to brief the case as written, I would say Taney says this and then he says the opposite. Okay, it doesn't make sense. So which one is it? You can't conclude it. Well, you remove the tirade and it makes sense. All right. Court, Supreme Court of the United States. Judicial history. After losing his case requesting freedom from slavery in the Supreme Court of Missouri, slave Dred Scott sued owner John Sanford for battery and for freedom from slavery in U.S. Circuit Court in Missouri under diversity jurisdiction, Scott residing in Missouri and Sanford residing in New York at the time. That's what diversity jurisdiction means. The two litigants are living in 2 different states. Sanford objected to diversity jurisdiction on the basis of Scott not being a citizen of Missouri. U.S. Circuit Court overruled Sanford on the jurisdiction question, but ultimately, once the court got to the merits of the case, decided in favor of Sanford on questions of battery and status of Scott as a slave. Scott appealed the issue of his status as a slave alone to the Supreme Court of the United States, but the Supreme Court took up and reviewed all issues, including the issue of jurisdiction and the issue of the constitutionality of the Missouri Compromise, which came up during arguments over the status of Scott as a slave. Facts. In 1820, the United States Congress passed an act commonly referred to as the Missouri Compromise, where Congress presumed all territories of the United States were U.S. colonies, over which Congress had full authority to pass any laws necessary to rule over the people in these colonies, independent of constitutional restrictions and guarantees of individual rights afforded to all U.S. citizens. Congress drew on Article 4, Section 3, Clause 2 of the Constitution, which states, quote, "The Congress shall have power to dispose of and make all needful rules and regulations respecting the territory or other property belonging to the United States," end quote. By this presumed authority, Congress deemed ownership of slaves illegal in certain territories of the United States, such as the territory that was to become the state of Maine, but deemed ownership of slaves legal in other territories, such as the territory that was to become the state of Missouri, where slavery was allowed to continue. However, it was argued that this clause of the Constitution relied on by Congress for the Missouri Compromise referred specifically and only to the territory in possession of the Congress of the Confederation prior to ratification of the Constitution, and not future territories the U.S. might acquire later, such as the territories of the Missouri Compromise. Even if Article 4, Section 3, Clause 2 applied to future territories, it was widely held by constitutional scholars and even the framers of the Constitution that, quote unquote, the needful rules and regulations power was a limited power that applied only to the setting up of a temporary framework of a government that the inhabitants of the territories could then use to create their own rules within the confines of the Constitution, with an emphasis on the word temporary until the territory could be formed into a state, and not having anything to do with granting Congress unchecked power to pass laws independent of the Constitution that violated the rights and privileges of U.S. citizens living in these territories. For example, the decision of slavery and all the rights and guarantees of property ownership that went with it were to be left to the people of the individual territories, independent of Congress, just as was done in the states, unless Congress were willing and able to pass a law that all the territories and states had to follow equally and uniformly on the matter. This is all Congress can do. This is the only power they have, okay? They could say either slavery was illegal in all territories and states or slavery was legal in all territories and states. Okay, do you get it? Do you get it? That is the crux of everything here in the Missouri. This is the whole issue of the Missouri Compromise and Dred Scott. It had nothing to do with slaves. It's just a side issue that became a circus. Okay, the issue here is the power Congress has. That's the only power they have. And in the Missouri Compromise, they didn't do that. So, first of all, in Dred Scott, they did not say the Constitution said that everybody had a right to own slaves. That they did not say that. And the second thing they said is they did not say slavery was legal everywhere. They said slavery was up to the states to decide until Congress got off their asses or until somebody sued and asked if the right to slavery is in the Constitution. Nobody did that. Okay, so this is why I'm reading the case brief, because it gets to the heart of the matter of the actual case. And you'll notice when you do the case brief, the question that comes up is not, is there a right to own another human in the Constitution? That is not in this case brief. Try it. Try to brief the freaking case. This should be every law school in the country should require their students to brief this case. Right now. This year. And if they're smart, they'll just copy what I just did, because this is the ultimate case brief, and this is going to go down in history. And I will never be known for anything, because all I'm doing is repeating what Taney the genius did. That was the best freaking takedown of a congressional act. So everybody should be studying Dred Scott as being the second, possibly the first. Marbury versus Madison is questionable now. I mean, it was the first time the Supreme Court struck down an act of Congress. This is the second time, but this was really good. He did a better job of it. Marbury versus Madison, it was tricky what he did, what he accomplished and what he did, but this one is tricky too, and he did a really good job. If you want to show how to strike down an act of Congress, straight on, this is how you do it. Okay, so I have 30 more minutes. Let's finish this. So those are the facts. And you notice I'm doing facts different. A lot of people, they'll just repeat what the Supreme Court says are the facts. Most students, law students, don't know how to brief a case, and probably most professionals. Here's what we should do before somebody could become a justice of the Supreme Court. Ask them to brief this case, because most of them went to Harvard, and Harvard obviously can't teach shit on how to brief a case. That's all they do. When you go to Harvard Law School, that's all they do is brief cases, but all they do is copy what's been done before. Facts are the most important. If you write the facts right, this is the most important part of a case brief. If you list the facts correctly, then everything else falls out from it. You don't have to do any more work. All the issues fall out. All the answers to the issues fall out. All the reasoning falls out. Everything falls out. It all has to do with the facts. If you write the facts properly. Now, there isn't a single person who's briefed this case before who starts in 1820 with the Missouri Compromise, because that is the main issue of the whole thing, is the Missouri Compromise. Everybody thinks the main issue is slavery. So try to write the facts of the case with the tirade in there. Good luck. Good luck, everybody. Bye. These are the facts as they should be written. And this is the most important part of the most important case brief in history that I'm doing right here. And all I'm doing is stating the facts as Taney saw them and as he took them down. Okay, so by this presumed authority, Congress deemed ownership of slaves illegal in certain territories of the United States, such as the territory that was to become the state of Maine, but deemed ownership of slaves legal in other territories, such as the territory that was to become the state of Missouri, where slavery was allowed to continue. However, it was argued that this clause of the Constitution relied on by Congress for the Missouri Compromise referred specifically and only to the territory in possession of the Congress of the Confederation prior to ratification of the Constitution, and not future territories the U.S. might acquire later, such as the territories of the Missouri Compromise. I'm rereading this. Even if Article 4, Section 3, Clause 2 applied to future territories, it was widely held by constitutional scholars and even framers of the Constitution that the needful rules and regulations power was a limited power that applied only to the setting up of a temporary framework of a government that the inhabitants of the territories could then use to create their own rules within the confines of the Constitution, with an emphasis on the word temporary until the territory could be formed into a state. In other words, they can't do Puerto Rico, where they're forever being controlled by Congress. That's a colony controlled by Congress. And it's unconstitutional. And that's why Puerto Rico is going to either become a state very soon or become its own independent country. All right. This is later. I do this in the implications part. This is tomorrow. And not having anything to do with granting Congress unchecked power to pass laws independent of the Constitution that violated the rights and privileges of U.S. citizens living in the territories. For example, the decision of slavery and all the rights and guarantees of property ownership that went with it were to be left to the people of the individual territories, independent of Congress, just as was done in the states, unless Congress were willing and able to pass a law that all the territories and states had to follow equally and uniformly on the matter. For instance, either slavery was illegal in all the territories and states, or slavery was legal in all the territories and states. Okay, one more thing. I'm sorry I have to do a sidebar. Right now, the Supreme Court is so spineless and so weak that whenever they have an issue they don't want to answer on rights, they leave it up to the states. Yeah, this issue is up to the states on whether they want to buy a car that's green or red. It is not up to the states to decide on people's rights. That's up to the Supreme Court. We have a right to freaking not have masks. Okay, you can't say it's up to the states to decide that. Sorry, people. That's the Supreme Court leaves the decisions up to the states on things that are not. So in here, they did say at the time it's up to the states to do that because the Supreme Court hadn't decided this issue yet, and maybe they were still spineless on this issue. But nobody presented the Supreme Court with the question that needed to be answered, which was, is slavery in the Constitution and is slavery a right? Politically, you had a political time bomb here, and all he was trying to do was strike down the Missouri Compromise. That's the first step. The first step to making slavery illegal was to strike down the Missouri Compromise. This is like a bunch of parents playing good cop, bad cop, and nobody wants to play the bad cop. The issue of slavery, Congress was too chicken shit to do their jobs and make slavery illegal throughout the whole country. So they did something illegal. They said, oh, you states decide. We can't decide. We don't want to do this because we don't want to be the bad cop. And we don't want to go up against the gay Nazi assholes. And who does? Seriously. I don't understand how Trump does. I don't understand how people have hundreds of them around them, because they're just like, you can't, they're just so assertive. They're so freaking worse than vampires to stop. Okay. So I get it on one level. On another level, I'm just explaining what happened and human nature and how we are where we are. Legally, constitutionally, the first step that needed to be taken in a lawful manner to making slavery illegal was to take down the Missouri Compromise. This is what the Supreme Court did. They booted the issue right back to Congress. Congress did not like that. And that's why they're having a fit and saying all this and blaming it. And that's why we got the Civil War. And that's what we're doing now. We're repeating history. Congress is too chicken shit to strike down the 16th Amendment. They're too chicken shit to stand up to the gay Nazi assholes and do this. And Trump is coming in and he's saying, look, we don't have to go through a civil war for this to happen. Okay, he's making us avoid the Civil War. All right, and I have to talk about Lincoln a little bit. I don't think he was strong enough. Lincoln was kind of weak in that he did the same thing. He also did not stand up to the gay Nazi ass. He wrote some nice stuff and he did some nice stuff, but he's just spineless. He did not stand up to them. He did not, because we went to civil war and that didn't have to happen. And Trump avoided this. Trump is avoiding civil war because the first step to getting down the other side is taking down the 16th Amendment. And Congress is going to be too weak, but Trump is working on that. And the Supreme Court is too weak. Right now, it's just human nature. Nobody wants to stand up to the gay Nazi assholes. But gay Nazi assholes are becoming weaker because, first of all, gay marriage was legalized, so we're weakening their hatred. That's one aspect of it. But you have to stand up to them, and we're weakening their money. But all this stuff has to happen right now. So as we're weakening their hatred by legalizing gay marriage, by accepting in the culture, we're making fewer and fewer gay Nazi assholes. So it's going to happen. But it's a time to stand up to the weaker ones now and say, okay, enough of this. We're going to take down the 16th Amendment. And okay, all right. So what's going on here is the first step to ending slavery was to take down the Missouri Compromise. And by the way, the 13th Amendment comes directly from the Missouri Compromise. And that needs to be struck down. Word for word, the 13th Amendment comes directly from the Missouri Compromise, which is evil like the 16th Amendment. These things just need to come down. Okay, finally, it was settled law at the time that when slaves were taken by their owners from a slave area into a non-slave area, it was up to the laws of the individual territories and states where the slave and owner had originally been domiciled, whether that slave would be considered manumitted or emancipated if he or she ever returned with his or her owner back to the slave area. Scott was a slave who lived mostly in the state of Missouri. There are laws in place that you need to follow until Congress grows a spine, is what I'm saying. Okay, you need to follow whatever laws are there. And you need to get rid of those laws legally. Because you have to do these changes legally. This is all they're saying. And then the war happened. And then they still did it illegally okay, the 13th Amendment did not end slavery, actually. Duh, ask any black person. Hey, black person, did the 13th Amendment end slavery? No. Okay, anyway. Scott was a slave who lived mostly in the state of Missouri, where slavery was legal. But during the 1830s, Scott traveled with his owner to two different areas where slavery was illegal: a U.S. territory that was deemed slave-free by the Missouri Compromise, and the state of Illinois, which was also deemed slave-free. When Scott returned to Missouri with Sanford, Scott asserted in Missouri state court that he automatically became both manumitted and emancipated because he had traveled with Sanford to slave-free areas of the country, and as a free man, Scott could sue Sanford for battery. The Supreme Court of Missouri ultimately decided, based on Missouri state law, that Scott's actions made him neither manumitted nor emancipated. Scott then brought the case to federal court under diversity jurisdiction. See, he brought it under diversity jurisdiction. Why? Because this is the other thing, people. There are two different ways you could bring to federal court. There are two different ways you could bring a case. One of them is under diversity, and one of them is under constitutional question, or like a real law of some kind that either Congress made or a constitutional question. They didn't bring it under constitutional question, which they should have. They should have said it is unconstitutional for one human to own another human. Period. Okay, instead they did all this complicated diversity jurisdiction and they asked all these stupid questions, and this was not accidental. Okay, this was very political all the way, and it was lawyers drafting this. But I think the good lawyers drafting this saw that the Missouri Compromise had to come down first. The bad lawyers drafting this made the argument so extreme that it was so stupid that it gave an in for the fraudsters. Anyway, okay, all right. I have 20 minutes to finish this. Let's do this. Okay. So this is the first thing. Why did you bring it under diversity jurisdiction if you were trying to take down slavery? Well, the reason you would do that if you were a good lawyer trying to do that is you say, well, because the Missouri Compromise has to come down first. But you could have brought that as constitutional question. Anyway, it's very frustrating. It's very frustrating, all of it, because you could see it all replaying itself right now. Actually, just vote Trump, people. Don't worry about it. I promise. Just vote Trump or don't even do that. Don't even support Trump. Call him and ask him if he's going to take down the 16th Amendment, if that's the goal. And if not, don't support him, because I'm not sure if that's the goal. He's just acting like it is all the time. Everything he does seems to be going in that direction. So anyway, Scott then brought the case to federal court under diversity jurisdiction, claiming Sanford, who had moved away from Missouri by that time, was a citizen of New York, while Scott was a citizen of Missouri. Sanford claimed the U.S. Circuit Court did not have jurisdiction because Scott was a slave at the time of filing his lawsuit and therefore not a citizen of Missouri. In his argument, however, Sanford did not rely on the decision of the Supreme Court of Missouri to claim Scott was a slave at the time of his filing. Sanford instead claimed only that Scott was not a citizen of Missouri because Scott was of African descent and therefore could never be a citizen of any state, including Missouri, no matter what the Supreme Court of Missouri said. God damn. Basing its decision solely on this argument presented by Sanford and not on any facts or arguments presented by Scott in his previous cases, the Circuit Court overruled Sanford's claim that Scott was not a citizen of Missouri, granted jurisdiction, and told Sanford to proceed to present arguments that Scott was still a slave. Oh my God. You could see the trap. You could see how the good guys, non-gay dumbass morons, had a plan and a good way to take down slavery legally. And you could see how the gay Nazi assholes could see it coming and thwarted it every step of the way and led them into a trap. Into a freaking media catastrophe. A public, yeah. Oh my God. Anyway, it's just a public announcement disaster. What it looks like is, the lower court said Scott was a citizen and not a slave. And it looks like the lower court overturned slavery. And they did not do that at all. They did not do that at all. That's what it looks like. And then it looks like the Supreme Court struck down a lower court's decision to say that slavery was illegal. And that's not what happened at all. Holy shit. I'm looking at it now a little bit differently, like even from an even bigger picture. And it's just freaking frustrating how the non-gay dumbass morons went straight into this. And how none of this could have been possible unless the gay Nazi assholes controlled the media at the time, which they did, and they do now. So that's the first thing you got to do. Go after the media as Trump did. Fake news. Before you do your shit. So Trump saw this. That's good. I think he read my law school stuff. I think smart people went back. I was writing shit like this all the way back years before Trump came in. Anyway, this decision by the circuit court granting jurisdiction without considering facts outside of Sanford's plea and abatement to jurisdiction was the main decision under scrutiny in Dred Scott. On later arguments presented after jurisdiction was granted, the circuit court ruled that Scott was still a slave on the grounds that Missouri law controlled on this issue and that there were certain steps that had to be taken by Scott in order to be manumitted and emancipated, other than simply traveling into free territories, that Scott did not do to become a free man and become a recognized citizen by the government. When Scott appealed the case to the United States Supreme Court, he only appealed the part of the decision by the circuit court that stated he was still a slave under Missouri law, and not the part that claimed the circuit court had jurisdiction, presumably because that decision was in Scott's favor. No. Now, I might rewrite this because they did that because it was a plan by the gay Nazi assholes all along. It was a trap, but whatever. It was a trap to make it look like what it wasn't. The Supreme Court nevertheless decided to take up both the jurisdiction issue and the issue of the status of Scott as a slave, against arguments that the Supreme Court only had the authority to take up the issue of that Scott appealed, his status as a slave, and not the jurisdiction issue. In the process of deciding the jurisdiction issue, the court had to take up the issue of Scott's status as a slave at the time of filing his case. And in the process of deciding Scott's status as a slave, the Supreme Court took up the issue of the constitutionality of the Missouri Compromise, once again against arguments that the Supreme Court was acting extrajudicially in taking up this issue because, as argued, settling the issue was not required to determine the status as a slave of Scott at the time of filing the case. Okay, I'm not even paying attention to what I'm writing right now because it's 100% accurate what I wrote here, and I'll probably stand by it because it's a case brief. But the bigger picture is just human nature. Nobody wants to stand up to the slave owners because they're gay Nazi assholes, and if you stand up to them, you'll pay personally. They'll kill your family members. It's like standing up to the mafia, actually, and they knew it. So what this is a bunch of people just politically, they're good people. Okay, Taney, he was, I think he was a non-gay dumbass moron, I'm pretty sure. It could have been a very smart gay guy, but Andrew Jackson appointed him. And his arguments were just amazing, how he took down the Missouri Compromise. But the point was, he had to get the issue before the court, and it was like pulling teeth to get that issue up there, because everybody knew that was the first step to taking down slavery. And they were doing everything they could. It was like amazing. It was just like the Marbury versus Madison. It's like all these power struggles that I'm seeing a little bit more insightful and human nature. And you can see the battles going on between the good and the evil. And they're trying to do this. And the media just freaking bit them in the ass. Got them in the end. It was like, anyway. Okay, so here are the real issues. I'm standing by this case brief. I'm just seeing more historically, I'm seeing the even bigger picture that's repeating itself right now. Nobody wants to stand up to the gay Nazi assholes. There's a bunch of non-gay dumbass morons, and even the smart ones who know what's going on. I always paint the Republicans as being really good warriors who have their hearts in the right place, which is to destroy evil. Okay, so they have big hearts that way, and they're very brave, and they will die just trying to destroy evil, because they're like, in the religious sense, they will die to destroy evil. But the brain sense, they're so stupid and loyal that they will believe whatever they're told is evil. So they're like dogs in that way. Very loyal. So if a good person, if an evil person gets control of their heart, it says that person's evil, Putin evil or whatever. They will die trying to go up. And I'm not saying Putin is good or bad. I'm saying everybody is good and bad. But I'm saying that their honor and valor is easily misplaced. Be controlled by gay Nazi assholes. Okay, so they have the spine. They just don't have the brain. I hate saying that because, And I view the Democrats as having the brain and no spine. Right now I'm deciding I can't stand that. Worse than... I'm going to go with the loyal dogs. The Republicans. They're stupid. They just need to be educated. I don't know what to do about spineless Democrats. Because they're educated. They just don't have the spine. And what do you do about that? You can't give somebody a spine that they don't have. You could always educate somebody. But you can't give them a spine that they don't have. So Democrats, you guys suck. I was Democrat, independent all along, I guess. But right now, I can't handle that. I can't handle the people who see what's going on. They know this and let it happen. The ones who see this and still argue against Trump or argue against this stuff or put on the mask when they know that it's spreading disease more than not. And that's the other part is they know anyway. I don't know. I'm being judgy myself because I'm guilty of all this. I'm guilty of all this shit. So okay, let's just get on with it. Here are the issues. Okay, I've got a few minutes to do this. Issues. Usually there's one, and the issue should be is there a right to slavery in the Constitution? No, that has yet to be answered by the Supreme Court, by the way, and that's why the 13th Amendment needs to come down, and the Supreme Court needs to get its heads out of its asses, grow a freaking spine, and write the lawsuit that needs to be written, which is under the 9th Amendment, there is no right. First of all, they need to state there's no right to own another human anywhere in the Constitution. Okay, that's number one. And then number two, they need to say there is a right not to be owned by another human under the 9th Amendment. Because that's what the Supreme Court, that's the ruling that this Supreme Court needs to make right now and strike down the 13th Amendment. Okay? And of course, they won't do it because they'll say, oh, if we say we're going to strike down the 13th Amendment, all the gay Nazi assholes in the media are going to accuse us of being racist and saying slavery's okay. It's like, no, because the 13th Amendment, of course, so they're being run by gay Nazi assholes because they're spineless and they know it. I can't imagine somebody at the level of Supreme Court does not know everything that I'm writing right now. So anyway. And now they're trying to plot a way to do it this way and that way. And it's just like, just come out and say it. But maybe it is too soon. We don't want to crumble into civil war, it's already kind of there. But no, I'm talking real civil war. This is like little shit. We're going to be all right. Okay, issues. Does the U.S. Supreme Court have the authority to take up the issue of jurisdiction regardless of whether this issue is raised by an appellant? So these are just... These are sideshows that Taney was forced to answer, by the way. He's just trying to strike down the Missouri Compromise, but he was forced, and he answered all these in a page or two less because they're just straw man arguments. It's stupid. This had already been established. He didn't establish anything new. It's just that was an issue that was raised that Taney had to address. Okay, does the U.S. Supreme Court have the authority to take up the issue of jurisdiction, regardless of whether this issue is raised by an appellant? Duh. Yes, they do. That was already established. But it's just, we have to write it down. Issue 2. Does the U.S. Supreme Court have the authority to take up any issue it so chooses having to do with a decision in a case originating in a lower U.S. court, such as the U.S. Circuit Court in Missouri, even if the issue is not required to settle the case? This one, they tried to make it a controversy. The gay Nazi assholes did. It's just sidebar issues. They're just sidebar issues. Gay Nazi assholes are very good at getting non-gay dumbass morons to chase all these red herrings and shit. And of course, the end. Okay. Number 3. Does Article 4, Section 3, Clause 2 of the Constitution apply to U.S. territories acquired after the ratification of the Constitution? Huge. That was a great issue that Taney answered very definitively. Number 4, Does the Constitution impliedly grant Congress the authority to set up temporary systems of governance in the U.S. territories for the purpose of preparing the territories for admission into the Union as states? Yes. I'm just doing it according to the actual format for all case briefs. So let's just follow the format. Number 5, does the Constitution grant Congress the unchecked power to make laws concerning rights of U.S. citizens living in U.S. territories that contradict the rights and privileges granted to all U.S. citizens in the Constitution? No, of course not. That's the main issue right there. It's about power is all this is. Number 6, does the Missouri Compromise, where Congress deemed ownership of slaves illegal in some territories but deemed ownership of slaves legal in other territories, violate the Constitution? Yes, with a capital Y-E-S. There's not a single smart person who's going to say no to that. And if they do, they're Nazis or they're non-gay dumbass morons who are being controlled by Nazis. Number 7, when Scott traveled with his owner, these last 3 are easily answered. Everything falls from the facts. When Scott traveled with his owner to a territory that was deemed slave-free by the Missouri Compromise, did this act emancipate Scott? Did it make him a citizen? No. When Scott traveled with his owner to a state that was slave-free, did this action emancipate Scott? No. Did the U.S. Circuit Court in Missouri have jurisdiction over this case? No. Case thrown out based on procedural. The holdings. Yes, the U.S. Supreme Court has the authority to take up the issue of jurisdiction regardless of whether this issue is raised by an appellant. Yes, the U.S. Supreme Court has the authority to take up any issue it so chooses having to do with the decision in a case originating in a lower U.S. court, such as the U.S. Circuit Court in Missouri, even if the issue is not required to settle the case. 3, no, Article 4, Section 3, Clause 2 of the Constitution does not apply to U.S. territories acquired after the ratification of the Constitution. It does not apply to Puerto Rico, Guam. It does not apply to any of these. 4, yes, the Constitution impliedly grants Congress the authority to set up temporary systems of governance in U.S. territories for the purpose of preparing the territories for admission into the Union as states. Temporary, not 30 years of owning Puerto Rico or whatever it is. No, the Constitution does not grant Congress the unchecked power to make laws concerning the rights of U.S. citizens living in the U.S. territories that contradict the rights and privileges granted to all U.S. citizens in the Constitution. You can't be having 2 different governments. Like either Puerto Rico is a state or it's a territory on the way to becoming a state, or it's a country on its own. You can't have this in limbo thing where Congress has its little colony and they do whatever they want. And they fleece the hell out of Puerto Rico or the other way, or they need to be like us or not like us and follow the Constitution. Yes, the Missouri Compromise, where Congress deemed ownership of slaves illegal in some territories and deemed ownership of slaves legal in other territories, violates the Constitution. The main issue of this entire case. 7, 8, and 9 were just very easily answered. No, when Scott traveled with his owner to a territory that was deemed slave-free by the Missouri Compromise, this action did not emancipate Scott. No, when Scott traveled with his owner to a state that was slave-free, this action alone did not emancipate Scott. No, the U.S. Circuit Court in Missouri did not have jurisdiction over this case. It's going to be impossible to get any kind of black people on board with anything I'm saying here. Not impossible, but it's just too knee-jerk. They're too close. They're too personal. It looks racist on the outside because it was meant to look racist on the outside. But, they don't understand that this is the way to truly strike down slavery once and for all. They're still under slavery right now. But it's going to be done with or without them, thank goodness. Reasoning. There were 2 criticisms against the Supreme Court that claimed the court was making extrajudicial rulings on this case. One had to do with the court taking up the issue of jurisdiction without it being specifically appealed by any of the parties. That's discussed here. And the other had to do with the court taking up the issue of the constitutionality of the Missouri Compromise, arguably without it being needed to settle the case. That's discussed in number 2 below. On the issue of jurisdiction, majority opinion argues that while the Supreme Court has broad power over all laws in the United States, including the state laws that violate the Constitution also strictly limits the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court in bright-line ways. For this reason, the question of jurisdiction is critical for any case filed in federal court, a situation that is different for state courts. And appellants can neither stipulate to nor waive rights to jurisdiction in federal courts the way they can in state courts. The issue of jurisdiction in federal courts can therefore be addressed by the Supreme Court at any time the court sees an error on this issue in a lower federal court, regardless of whether the issue was raised on appeal by an appellant. Majority cites settled law on this case, which has not changed to this day. As discussed below, Justices McLean and Curtis dissented on this ruling on the basis that the reason given for lack of jurisdiction by Sanford, that Scott was of African descent and people of African descent could never be U.S. citizens under any circumstances, was insufficient on its face, and given no other arguments by Sanford, the decision of the Circuit Court to deny this outrageous argument and grant jurisdiction could not be reviewed. Majority dismissed this argument, saying all Sanford had to do is claim Scott was not a U.S. citizen in order for the Supreme Court to take a hard look at all facts pertaining to whether Scott was a U.S. citizen, not just those facts put forth by Sanford. The majority states, quote, "The case before us still more strongly imposes upon this court the duty of examining whether the court below has not committed an error in taking jurisdiction and giving a judgment for costs in favor of the defendant. For in Capron versus Van Norden, the judgment was reversed because it did not appear, in italics, that the parties were citizens of different states. They might or might not be. But in this case, it does appear, that the plaintiff was born a slave, and if the facts upon which he, Scott, not Sanford, relies have not made him free, then it appears affirmatively on the record that he is not a citizen, and consequently his suit against Sanford. Another thing I changed throughout the case was Sanford was changed to Sandford by the fraudsters. So that needs to be changed. It was not a suit between citizens of different states, and the court had no authority to pass any judgment between the parties. Parentheses added. This is at page 6. The majority ultimately ruled in favor of Sanford on the jurisdiction issue, but not for the reasons Sanford presented. Majority ruled in favor of Sanford on the basis that Missouri law controlled, and Missouri law said Scott was not free, and therefore not a U.S. citizen at the time of filing the suit. Okay, in parentheses, confusion on this point was exploited by the fraudsters in Dred Scott versus Sanford, who made it appear the majority not only agreed with Sanford that Scott was not a U.S. citizen at the time of filing the case, but that the majority also agreed that the reason Scott was not a U.S. citizen at the time of filing his case was that he was of African descent and therefore could never be a U.S. citizen, which is patently false. Okay? So issue 2. The main issue here is whether the U.S. Supreme Court had the authority to take up the issue of the constitutionality of the Missouri Compromise. Once the court took up the issue of jurisdiction, it ultimately decided that Missouri state law is both controlling and clear on the issue of Scott not being a free person, and therefore not a U.S. citizen, when Scott returned to Missouri from free areas of the country with his owner. As it turned out, this decision by the Supreme Court of Missouri was valid, regardless of whether the Missouri Compromise was constitutional or not. So it was argued the U.S. Supreme Court had no authority to take up and settle an unneeded issue, especially one involving such a weighty subject as the constitutionality of a congressional act. Majority argued that because the Supreme Court decides the supreme law of the land as keeper, protector, and final interpreter of the U.S. Constitution, if it sees an issue within the jurisdiction of one of its lower courts that the court feels it can resolve in a precedent-setting manner without having to have the lower court struggle to answer the question over and over again, the Supreme Court can and should take up this issue and settle it, regardless of whether it is critical to settle the case, for the sake of expediency. This was particularly true in this case where the circuit court went ahead and decided the issue of the status of Scott as a slave despite not having jurisdiction, possibly erring in its reasoning. The majority opinion states, quote, It is true that the result either way, by dismissal or by judgment for the defendant, makes very little, if any, difference in a pecuniary or personal point of view to either party. But the fact that the result would be very nearly the same to the parties in either form of judgment would not justify this court in sanctioning an error in the judgment which is patent on the record, and which, if sanctioned, might be drawn into precedent and lead to serious mischief and injustice in some future suit. We proceed, therefore, to inquire whether the facts relied on by plaintiff entitled him to his freedom. Okay, those facts eventually led to the issue of the constitutionality of the Missouri Compromise, which the court took up and settled. The next issue. Okay, so the court needs to practice this power way more now. It's so stupid, all the little roadblocks that they put up themselves and the Congress pretends to put up, that they say, no, we can't see this case because of this, because of that. It's bullshit. They could see so much shit and get a lot of shit settled if they just grow a spine and settle it. Okay? Especially, I'm talking about rights. When it comes to human rights, which is the pro se constitutional challenges that I've been submitting, like 50 of them or 60 of them, whatever, they should be able to take that up immediately without even going through the appeals process. They could take it up today and it would be constitutional and it would be the right thing to do. Without me appealing it, actually. I appealed a lot of them and, oh no, to appeal it to the Supreme Court, you have to pay $8,000 or something. It's very expensive. It's like 800, whatever. And you have to print out 9 copies on a printer. Where the hell? I bought a printer, but I'm not going to do it. Anyway. Majority argues that the clause in the Constitution, Article 4, Section 3. Oh, I did appeal, by the way, a long time ago. I have filed an appeal to the Supreme Court. And they rejected it, what they do is they just ignore it. And screw them. Majority argues that the clause, and it's not them, it's the court clerk I called who was gay and answered the phone, and I'm asking these questions. And the Supreme Court clerk answering the phone was a gay guy. Okay, and that's just like, oh, shit. That's why I don't do it. If I call there and there's still gay guys answering the phone, and it's the same at the appeals court. You call to ask them a question and it's a gay court clerk answering the phone. And it's just like, I'm over it. They're just controlling the court system. Majority argues that the clause of the Constitution, this is the third issue. Majority argues that the clause in the Constitution, Article 4, Section 3, Clause 2, that Congress relies on for the act commonly called the Missouri Compromise, does not apply to territories acquired by the United States after ratification of the Constitution. The clause instead was a special one-time provision needed at the time to instruct what to do with a certain territory and certain property acquired by the new government upon the ratification of the Constitution. The full majority opinion on this point, penned by Chief Justice Roger P. Taney, will not be reproduced here, and I showed you where you could find it. But it should be it's 13 pages long. But it should be required reading in all law school curriculum as a master class for how to interpret the Constitution prior to deeming an act of Congress as unconstitutional. Majority opinion reviews the history that led to the clause, reviews the comments and thoughts of the framers with regard to the clause, the position of the clause in the Constitution, the clauses preceding and proceeding the clause, the phraseology of the clause, the exact words used in the clause, and the illogical implications of alternative meanings to the clause. Majority concludes, whether therefore we take the particular clause in question by itself or in connection with the other provisions in the Constitution, we think it clear, and it is, that it applies only to the particular territory of which we have spoken and cannot, by any just rule of interpretation, be extended to territory which the new government might afterwards obtain from a foreign nation. Period. It is so good. The only plausible argument against the majority opinion on this issue comes from the dissenting opinion of Justice McLean, where he claims that esteemed Chief Justice John Marshall had stated in 2 different parts of his majority opinion in American and Ocean Insurance Companies versus Cantor, that Article 4, Section 3, Clause 2 does indeed grant Congress authority to govern over territories acquired after the ratification of the Constitution. However, majority calls McLean out for taking these statements out of context in order to mislead. He purposely does this. It pisses me off. And they really called him out, and he really nailed them on this. On the first misleading quote of Justice Marshall, Majority writes, but the case of the American and Ocean Insurance Companies versus Cantor has been quoted as establishing a different construction of this clause of the Constitution. There is, however, not the slightest conflict between the opinion now given and the one referred to, and it is only by taking a single sentence out of the latter and separating it from the context, taking it out of context, that even the appearance of conflict can be shown. He took it out of context. We need not comment on such a mode of expounding on an opinion of the court. Indeed, it is most commonly misrepresents instead of expounding it. And this is fully exemplified in the case referred to, where if one sentence is taken by itself, the opinion would appear to be in direct conflict with that now given. But the words which immediately follow that sentence show that the court did not mean to decide this point, but merely affirmed the power of Congress to establish a government in the territory, leaving it an open question whether that power was derived from this clause in the Constitution, or was to be necessarily inferred from a power to acquire territory by cession from the foreign government. The opinion on this part of the case is short, and we give the whole of it to show how well the selection of a single sentence is calculated to mislead. So this is the Supreme Court saying, fuck you, McLean, for purposely, you probably a gay Nazi asshole. It could be McLean who was actually, to the forensic historians, search McLean as well, and all his, for being gay. Because this is very gay what he did. Completely and purposely misleading. Taking sentences out of context in his arguments, okay? The majority then proceeds to dismantle the first half of McLean's argument. For the second misleading quote of Justice Marshall, the majority writes, there is another sentence in the opinion which has been commented on, which even in a still more striking manner shows how one may mislead or be misled by taking out a single sentence from the opinion of a court and leaving out the view what precedes and follows. This is exactly what I am saying what happened to them. So it happened to them here, and they're saying that it's happening, and now I'm saying it happened to you guys too. I'm sorry. After you guys went on, they did it to you guys as well. So good for you for pointing it out in McLean, but then McLean turned around and did it to this case. I think it was McLean or a court clerk in McLean. I would say McLean is gay, just from this. The majority then proceeds to dismantle the second and last part of McLean's argument. McLean is the one doing this, or a court clerk of his, or a court clerk of Daniel's, or they all did it together. But it's all gay Nazi assholes, and those are the ones to look at. Okay. Okay. So 4, 5, and 6. Okay. Surely the framers took into account that the U.S. government would be expanding and acquiring lands from other governments after the ratification of the Constitution, though, right? The Constitution even grants Congress the power to admit new states in Article 4, Section 3, Clause 1, stating new states may be admitted by the Congress into this union. So how were the new territories to be governed until they became states if Article 4, Section 3, Clause 2 does not apply to these newly acquired territories? The majority admits that this question has yet to be answered by the court directly and sets out to answer the question more definitively. So this is another thing. This is another fantastic thing that this case does. This case does a lot of great stuff, okay, that was completely buried by the Nazis over their shit. At first, the majority seems better at describing what Congress cannot do than at describing what Congress can do. Majority states, there is certainly no power given by the Constitution to the federal government to establish or maintain colonies bordering on the United States or at a distance, to be ruled and governed at its own pleasure, nor to enlarge its territorial limits in any way except by the admission of new states. That power is plainly given, and if a new state is admitted, it needs no further legislation by Congress, because the Constitution itself defines the relative rights and powers and duties of the state, and the citizens of the state, and the federal government. But no power is given to acquire a territory to be held and governed permanently in that character. Puerto Rico. This still stands, by the way. Nobody has ever contradicted. Oh, maybe they did in the what's called the anyway. Okay, let's. After more careful thought, however, majority eventually concludes that the power granted to Congress to acquire territory and admit states in the Constitution implies the power to govern that territory, but in a limited way. Congress can set up a general framework of a government depending on the conditions of the territory, but As described in the next section, Congress cannot legislate anything in particular concerning the rights and privileges of the citizens living in the territories that would be in violation of the Constitution. Majority states, the power to acquire necessarily carries with it the power to preserve and apply to the purposes for which it was acquired. The form of government to be established necessarily rested in the discretion of Congress. It was their duty to establish the one that would be best suited for the protection and security of the citizens of the United States and other inhabitants who might be authorized to take up their abode there. And that must always depend upon the existing condition of the territory as to the number and character of its inhabitants and their situation in the territory. In some cases, a government consisting of persons appointed by the federal government would be best subserve the interests of the territory when the inhabitants were few and scattered and new to one another. In other instances, it would be more advisable to commit the powers of self-government to the people who had settled in the territory as being the most competent to determine what was best for their own interests. But some form of civil authority would be absolutely necessary to organize and preserve civilized society and prepare it to become a state. And what is the best form must always depend on the condition of the territory at the time, and the choice of the mode must depend on the exercise of a discretionary power of Congress, acting within the scope of its constitutional authority, and not infringing upon the rights of person or rights of property of the citizen who might go there to reside, or for any other lawful purpose. It was acquired by the exercise of this discretion, and it must be held and governed in like manner until it is fitted to be a state. But the power of Congress over the person or property of a citizen can never be a mere discretionary power under our Constitution and form of government. The powers of the government and the rights and privileges of the citizen are regulated and plainly defined by the Constitution itself, period. Oh my God, 5, 6, and 7. Oh, I'm not going to finish this. I have to go to work. I can't freaking believe this. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to finish this later tonight and then combine it with this one. Okay, I got to go to work. Everything's going to be okay, everybody. Living my best life. Hang in there. And Godspeed to everybody coming out the other side in one piece. P-E-A-C-E. Okay, bye. Hello, everybody. Happy Saturday, December 10th, 2022. This morning, early in the morning, I wasn't able to finish. I'm not in the Target parking lot, though. It's okay. I'm at the Owens Mouth parking structure. What I'm going to do is what I planned to do at the end of last video. I'm just going to continue it and tag it so that it's all one video that's going to be called Part 8. It's going to be called Part 8 of the Music of the Night Media Swap Stock Tutorial. Okay, and we're going to do that right now. And then later, if I have time, if I don't fall asleep, I'm going to do Part 9, which is reading the last 11 pages. Okay, without much further ado. Number 5, so I'm just tagging it on there, on the end, so no explanation needed. 5, in the case brief, it's the reasoning of the case brief and on issue number 5. The arguments that try to outline the limited power of Congress to legislate laws that might contradict the Constitution regarding property rights of citizens are interspersed with arguments, like the one cited above, that try to outline and give examples of what Congress does have a right to do under the Constitution. So the following paragraphs actually precede the paragraphs cited above, but these paragraphs nevertheless best sum up the majority's views on this issue, so it is presented here as follows. Quote, all we mean to say on this point is that as there is no express regulation in the Constitution defining the power which the general government may exercise over the person or property of a citizen in a territory thus acquired, the court must necessarily look to the provisions and principles of the Constitution and its distribution of powers for the rules and principles by which its decisions must be governed. Taking this rule to guide us, it may be safely assumed that citizens of the United States who migrate to a territory belonging to the people of the United States cannot be ruled as mere colonists, dependent upon the will of the general government, and to be governed by any laws it may think proper to impose. The principle upon which our governments rest, and upon which alone they continue to exist, is the union of the states. is the union of states, sovereign and independent within their own limits in their internal and domestic concerns, and bound together as one people by a general government, possessing certain enumerated and restricted powers delegated to it by the people of the several states, and exercising supreme authority within the scope of the powers granted to it throughout the dominion of the United States. A power, therefore, in the general government to obtain and hold colonies and dependent territories over which they might legislate without restriction would be inconsistent with its own existence in its present form. Whatever it acquires for the benefit of the people of the several states who created it. It is their trustee acting for them and charged with duty of promoting the interests of the whole people of the United States in exercise of the powers specifically granted. Citation page 60. U.S. 447 to 40. Okay. Even Justice Curtis, in his dissenting opinion, disagreeing with the majority that Article 4, Section 3, Clause 2 does not grant Congress power to govern over newly acquired territories, at least had to agree with the majority that whatever powers the Constitution grants to Congress over territories, it does not grant Congress unlimited power to make rules and regulations in territories that contradicted the rights and privileges granted to all U.S. citizens in the Constitution. So even the guy dissenting writes this. Justice Curtis writes this. Sorry, I gotta yawn. Okay, sorry. If then this clause does not contain a power to legislate respecting the territory, what are the limits of that power? To this I answer that, in common with all the other legislative powers of Congress, it finds limits in the express prohibitions on Congress not to do certain things, that in the exercise of the legislative power, Congress cannot pass an ex post facto law or a bill of attainder, and so in respect to each of the other prohibitions contained in the Constitution. So it's just saying it must follow the Constitution, even in the territories. Even Curtis agrees with this. Okay, so that's number 5, and that's the reasoning behind no, the Constitution does not grant Congress the unchecked power to make laws concerning rights of U.S. citizens living in the U.S. territories that contradict the rights and privileges granted to all U.S. citizens in the Constitution. And that was their reasoning. And I'm going to read next. Yes, the Missouri Compromise, where Congress deemed ownership of slaves illegal in some territories, but deemed ownership of slaves legal in other territories, violates the Constitution. Things go quickly from here. That's why I'm just adding it on. I probably had only 10 more minutes of reading to do. So let's just tack this on, and then we'll submit it. We'll post it to YouTube as one video. Once majority settled that Article 4, Section 3, Clause 2 of the Constitution does not grant Congress unlimited power to make laws in U.S. territories that run contrary to the Constitution, regardless of whether this clause even applies to territories obtained after ratification of the Constitution, it was relatively straightforward for a majority to deem the Missouri Compromise as unconstitutional. So all the big heavy lifting is done up to this point, and now it's just the 6, 7, 8, and 9 just fall by. They're just knocked down like dominoes. Okay, it was relatively straightforward for a majority to deem the Missouri Compromise as unconstitutional. Because the Missouri Compromise deemed ownership of slavery legal in some territories but illegal in other territories. This was in direct contradiction with the limited powers granted to Congress in the Constitution to pass laws that did not contradict the rights and privileges granted to all U.S. citizens in the Constitution. Congress could not simultaneously grant Sanford the right to own Scott in one area of the country and then take away that same right just because Sanford traveled to another area that Congress deemed slave-free. The constitutional crisis that such a law might cause did not go unnoticed, even as the law was being passed in 1820, Majority alludes to the great unrest the Missouri Compromise caused with the constitutional scholars, including many framers of the Constitution at the time of its passing. But the footnotes from the concurring opinion of Justice Campbell give the best examples of the unrest as follows. So I found this in the concurring opinion of Justice Campbell. These quotes, they're fantastic. Mr. Varnum said, the bill provides such a government as had never been known to the United States. Mr. Eustace says, the government laid down in this bill is certainly a new thing in the United States. Mr. Lucas says, it has been remarked that this bill establishes elementary principles never previously introduced in the government of any territory of the United States. Granting the truth of this observation, etc. I don't know why. I don't know what that is. Okay. Mr. Macon wrote, quote, my first objection to the principle contained in this section is that it establishes a species of government unknown to the United States. Mr. Boyle, quote, were the president an angel instead of a man, I would not clothe him with this power. Mr. G.W. Campbell, quote, on examining, they're all talking about the Missouri Compromise, the bill passed by Congress. These are Congress people, these are scholars, these are commentators, and some framers are in here. Okay, Mr. Boyle says, okay, we're the president. That was a good quote. Mr. G.W. Campbell says, quote, on examining the section, it will appear that it really establishes a complete despotism. I mean, they're pointing this out as fascism, the Missouri Compromise. It's just fascism. Mr. Sloan, quote, can anything be more repugnant to the principles of just government? Can anything be more despotic? Annals of Congress, 1803 to 1804. Mr. Jefferson wrote, the Missouri question is the most... Oh, this is Jefferson. This is our Mr. Jefferson, the one who this is the framers of the Constitution. The Missouri question is the most portentous one that ever threatened our Union. In the gloomiest moments of the Revolutionary War, I never had any apprehension equal to that I feel from this source. So this is page 60, US 518. This was, okay. As discussed above, majority readily dismissed the dissenting opinion of Justice McLean that claimed that Chief Justice Marshall had found constitutional authority for Congress to run territories as if they were colonies. But both McLean and Justice Curtis, in their dissenting opinions, made a different, somewhat weaker claim that the Missouri Compromise was constitutional because a slave was not to be considered property under the Constitution. Curtis in particular espoused this argument, giving long lists of examples where slaves were not considered property by other countries. Majority dismissed this argument by stating, and I think I had it in the main part, I think I've already read this before, but I'm going to read it again. It seems, however, to be supposed that because this is a brief outline and it assumes you don't have to read the case or read anything I wrote before. This stands alone. It seems, however, to be supposed that there is a difference between property and a slave and other property, and that different rules may be applied to it in expounding the Constitution of the United States, and the laws and usages of nations, and the writings of eminent jurists upon the relation of master and slave and their mutual rights and duties, and the powers which governments may exercise over it, have been dwelt upon in the argument. But in considering the question before us, it must be borne in mind that there is no law of nations standing between the people of the United States and their government and interfering with their relation to each other. The powers of the government and the rights of the citizen under it are positive and practical regulations plainly written down. The people of the United States have delegated to it certain enumerated powers and forbidden it to exercise others. It has no power over the person or property of a citizen but what the citizens of the United States have granted in the contract. And no laws or usages of other nations or reasoning of statesmen or jurists upon the relations of master and slave can enlarge the powers of the government or take from the citizens the rights they have reserved. And if the Constitution recognizes the right of property, which it doesn't, of the master of the slave, and makes no distinction between the description of property and other property owned by a citizen, no tribunal acting under the authority of the United States, whether it be legislative, executive, or judicial, has a right to draw such a distinction or deny to it the benefit of the provisions and guarantees which have been provided for the protection of private property against the encroachments of the government. End quote. Once the Missouri Compromise was deemed unconstitutional, the rest of the issues were disposed of relatively quickly, while Justice Nelson, who neither dissented nor concurred with the majority opinion, wrote a separate opinion that effectively concurred with the majority opinion. I don't know why they call it a separate opinion, that expounded in great detail on why the decision by the Supreme Court of Missouri concerning the status of Scott as a slave should control this issue entirely. Majority, in contrast, only touched on the issue lightly, so that the remaining three issues were disposed of relatively briefly at the end of the majority opinion, as follows. So Nelson wrote a whole bunch of went on and on why they shouldn't have even taken up this case, and just left it, not even taking it up, just left it to the state court. But anyway, this is how the final three just went boom. No, when Scott traveled with his owner to a territory that was deemed slave-free by the Missouri Compromise, this did not make Scott a free person because the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional and void. That was easy. No, when Scott traveled with his owner to a state that was slave-free, Illinois, this action did not emancipate Scott because state law controls on this issue. The Supreme Court of Missouri has decided the issue, and Scott filing the case in federal court appears to be an illegal attempt to evade state law. The United States Supreme Court must give deference to the decision of the state courts in this instance, as the law dictates. Majority concludes, quote, "It would ill become this court to sanction such an attempt to evade the law, or to exercise an appellate power in this circuitous way, which is forbidden to exercise in the direct and regular and invariable forms of judicial proceedings." They didn't like it. It was just a runaround. 9. No, the U.S. Circuit Court in Missouri did not have jurisdiction over this case because once issues number 7 and number 8 above are resolved, it is clear that Scott was not a citizen of Missouri when he filed his case in federal court under diversity jurisdiction. He should have filed it under federal question. If he's trying to get the Supreme Court to say that there is no right to own slaves in the Constitution, he should have filed a federal question that says slavery violates my 9th Amendment right to not be owned by another human. The fundamental human right to not be owned by another human, and it's under the 9th Amendment. The last two sentences of the majority opinion state, quote, "Upon the whole, therefore, it is the judgment of this court that it appears by the record before us that the plaintiff in error is not a citizen of Missouri in the sense in which that word is used in the Constitution, and that the Circuit Court of the United States, for that reason, had no jurisdiction in this case and could give no judgment in it. Its judgment for the defendant must consequently be reversed, and a mandate issued directing the suit to be dismissed for want of jurisdiction." And that's the end of the whole majority opinion. End quote. Decision. Okay. U.S. Circuit Court in Missouri erred in granting jurisdiction. Scott was still a slave and therefore not a U.S. citizen at the time of filing suit in U.S. Circuit Court. Case thrown out for lack of jurisdiction, so that the final ruling of the Supreme Court of the state of Missouri that Scott was a slave stood. U.S. Circuit Court also erred in part in its reasoning in determining Scott was still a slave. It could no longer be stated as fact that Scott traveled to a free territory when he traveled to the territory made slave-free by the Missouri Compromise, because the Missouri Compromise violated the U.S. Constitution and is now void. Concurring dissenting opinions. 1. Justice Wayne concurs with majority opinion and expounds on arguments in support of the idea that all the issues decided in the majority opinion were properly before the court and not decided extrajudicially. Justice Nelson neither concurs nor dissents with the majority opinion, but expounds on the argument that state law controls in this case, and that Missouri Supreme Court was correct in concluding that Scott could not be automatically emancipated just by traveling to free areas of the country with his owner. 2. Justice Greer concurs entirely with the majority opinion in one paragraph. 4. Justice Daniel concurs with majority opinion and, like Nelson, expounds on the argument that state law controls in this case, and that Missouri Supreme Court was correct in concluding that Scott could not be automatically emancipated just by traveling to free areas of the country with his owner. Justice Campbell concurs with majority opinion and, like Nelson, expounds on the argument that state law controls in this case, and that Missouri Supreme Court was correct in concluding that Scott could not be automatically emancipated just by traveling to free areas of the country with his owner. So these guys were pretty much saying that they shouldn't have even taken the case, that's fine. They took it and they agreed. 6. Justice Catrone concurs with majority opinion on everything except that the circuit court erred on jurisdiction, and, like Nelson, expounds on the argument that state law controls in this case, and that Missouri Supreme Court was correct in concluding that Scott could not be automatically emancipated just by traveling to free areas of the country with his owner. Okay, so here we have, if you're going to vote, if we're going to do a count, Taney is 1 because he wrote the majority opinion. Taney is 1. Justice Wayne concurs, that's 2. Justice Greer concurs, that's 3. Justice Daniel concurs, that's 4. Campbell concurs, is 5. Catrone concurs, that's 6, pretty much on the main issue. So there's just 2 justices. So there were 9. One of them didn't have an opinion, didn't concur, didn't do anything. What did he do? Justice Neal neither concurs nor dissents. I think he voted. I think the voting was like 7-2. It wasn't even close, people. And to think that 7 people said that shit about blacks. 7 people on the Supreme Court. I mean, are you freaking kidding me? With that fake news. Anyway, so the 2 dissenting opinions, and Justice McLean, who's probably gay and who's probably a big part of this whole thing. I'm pointing 100% to him. I said maybe, it's Justice McLean. Possibly Daniel's court clerks, but I don't think so now. Justice McLean dissents on the issue of jurisdiction being before the court because the circuit court rightfully relied solely on the arguments presented by Sanford in his plea and abatement. Says majority acted extrajudicially when bringing in facts presented by Scott in a previous case before the Supreme Court of Missouri when deciding jurisdiction. Dissents on issue of constitutionality of the Missouri Compromise being before the court because the issue of jurisdiction, once the court incorrectly decided to take it up, could be decided entirely without taking up the issue of the constitutionality of the Missouri Compromise. Dissents on the Missouri Compromise being unconstitutional for 2 reasons. 1, precedent dictates that Chief Justice John Marshall had already deemed the Missouri Compromise as constitutional in a previous case. False as fuck. What a lying piece of garbage. And 2, slave ownership should be treated differently from all other property ownership described in the Constitution. Agrees that state court decision in most cases should be given deference, but dissents that the decision of the Supreme Court of Missouri in this case should be given deference because the court had reversed course on how similar cases had been decided in the past. So he's even disagreeing with the Supreme Court of Missouri. Majority opinion addresses all these dissents except the one that says the Missouri Supreme Court did not have a right to change its mind. This was instead addressed in the concurring opinion of Justice Wayne, and Justice Wayne states, quote, "It is said, however, that the previous cases and the course of decisions in the state court of the state of Missouri on this subject were different, and that the courts had held the slave to be free on his return from a temporary residence in a free state. We do not see where this to be admitted that the circumstance would show that the settled course of decision at the time that this case was tried in the court below was not to be considered the law of the state. Certainly, it must be unless the first decision of a principle of law by a state court is to be permanent and irrevocable. This idea seems to be that the courts of a state are not to change their opinions, or if they do, the first decision is to be regarded by this court as the law of the state. It is certain, if this be so in the case before us, it is an exception to the rule governing this court in all other cases. But what court has not changed its opinions? What judge has not changed his? Okay, so he's trying to say no, we're going to go with the previous decisions of the Supreme Court of Missouri, which would be a very bad precedent. Boy, McLean was really all over he was just like freaking Nazi. Justice Curtis dissents on all the same arguments as McLean, with mostly the same reasoning, with two exceptions. 1. A majority of Curtis's 70-page dissent dismisses the argument presented by Sanford in his plea in abatement that a slave of African descent can never be emancipated and made a citizen of the United States. And most of the rest of Curtis's 70-page dissent argues that slaves should not be treated as property in the Constitution, rendering the majority argument that the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional because of the way this act handled slave as property as moot, whereas McLean presents both of these arguments in one or two sentences each. And the second way Curtis differs from McLean is that Curtis does not bring up the argument that Chief Justice John Marshall had deemed the Missouri Compromise as constitutional. So only McLean was misquoting John Marshall, and that's repeated many times. Like the whole 14th Amendment came up because they claimed that John Marshall wrote some, and it was all completely fabricated. Okay, that's it. I'm going to tack this on. It's just 10 minutes. It's 11:44. It's a good time to end this one. 11:44 p.m. Okay, I'm going to do it before it turns to 11:45. Everything's going to be okay, everybody. Hang in there. Living my best life. And Godspeed to everybody coming out the other end in one piece. P-E-A-C-E. It's still 11:44. I made it. Bye. Hello, everybody. Happy Monday, December 12th, 2022. This is going to be titled Music of the Night Media Swampstock Tutorial Part 9, I believe. Yes. It's Understanding the Great Dred Scott Fraud of 1857 helps restore the Supreme Court's full authority to strike down the 16th Amendment as unconstitutional. You know, this is the heart of corruption that we're getting at here. Once we take down the 16th Amendment, everything should start falling into place on our road to inevitable sustained world peace. Yay. Today I'm going to read the last 11 pages of this writing that I did, where it talks about the implications of this. Like, where do we go from here on correcting all the wrongs that have happened to our Constitution thanks to this fraud? So let's go to the last 11 pages. Positive implications in exposing the Great Dred Scott Fraud of 1857. One positive implication that stands out almost immediately when reading Taney's strong fraud-free arguments in Dred Scott v. Sanford concerning the Missouri Compromise is that these arguments still stand strong to this day, and that Congress currently holding territories such as Puerto Rico and Guam as its own personal colonies to do with it as it pleases is in violation of the Constitution. Congress needs to either admit these territories into the Union as states or allow them to become independent nations like the Philippines for the good of all involved. That's what happened with the Philippines. They just became a country on their own. And as for the good of everybody involved, including U.S. citizens as well as citizens of these territories alike, whatever their in limbo unconstitutional status may be, which is what it is right now. It's just unconstitutional. We need to end that. However, more profound positive implications of exposing the Great Dred Scott Fraud of 1857, of which putting Congress's currently unchecked power over U.S. territories back into check is only a small part, has to do with correcting the unhealthy imbalance in power this fraud created by undermining the Supreme Court's credibility, which is the only true power the Supreme Court has, colon. The executive branch of the government has the power of force. In other words, the military or the police force. The legislative branch of the government has the power of the purse strings through collecting taxes and controlling budgets. And the judicial branch has the power of facts, reason, and logic, or more specifically, the power of a good reputation for using facts, reason, and logic to decide issues, affording the Supreme Court the same type of respect and power bestowed upon a council of elders in other cultures. The Great Dred Scott Fraud of 1857 has undermined the Supreme Court's reputation and power even to this day, most likely preventing the Supreme Court from ever claiming and exerting its inherent power of judicial review over the amendment process. So judicial review means that when Congress passes a law, the Supreme Court has a power to strike it down as unconstitutional if the law goes against the Constitution. And it's a very important power. It's a very important power if it's exerted properly. And one thing the Supreme Court has yet to do, and because they've been weakened by the Dred Scott Fraud of 1857, is they haven't exerted their power of judicial review over amendments. That's the most important place to do it. You can't just let Congress amend the Constitution all at once and say, oh, well, so much for this, we're going to take away this right and that right and just do it this way instead. It just doesn't make sense. Because the Constitution, a correct Constitution, outlines the fundamental laws of peaceful self-governing. And these are like the fundamental laws of physics. They're so fundamental that you can't just alter them if you want. It's like, if the ball goes in the air, I don't like the fact that it drops back to the earth, so I'm going to change the laws of gravity because it's inconvenient for me. It just doesn't work that way when it comes to peaceful self-governing. It's like physics, and the framers of the Constitution actually listed the closest version of the fundamental laws of peaceful self-governing to date. So we got to go back to the original Constitution. People are afraid of that. They go, oh, there's slavery in the Constitution. No, if you watch the original videos, the Constitution does not state that you have a right to own another human. In fact, if the Constitution were used properly, you don't do an amendment to say the Constitution is wrong, therefore we're going to say there's no slavery allowed. That's the hoax. That's how they first began to weaken the Constitution. And when I say they, I mean I'm talking specifically gay Nazi assholes. Because if you don't know me by now, you will never know me. You have to watch other videos to see the history of gay mutation. And I'm gay, so anyway, enough. Let's just go on. I'm not going to get this done if I do these sidebars. This is what we need to do to get back to inevitable sustained world peace. When I say it's inevitable, I say we're going to get there. The only question is how long, how many deaths have to be on the way, how much corruption, how much damage is done. So that's the only question. But we are going to get there because the ball will fall down to earth once you throw it in the air. It's the laws of peaceful self-governing. I think we're going to get there very quickly, from here at least. And that's once the Supreme Court exerts its power to strike down, particularly the 16th Amendment. I think that has to go first, and then everything else starts to fall into place naturally. And let's go from here. Okay, the power of judicial review over acts of Congress is not expressly stated in the Constitution, and so too the power of judicial review over amendments to the Constitution is also not expressly stated in the Constitution. But it is implied just as much, if not more so, as the power of judicial review over acts of Congress, an important power that was settled by the great Chief Justice John Marshall in Marbury versus Madison. In effect, any amendment made to the Constitution after its ratification on December 15th, 1791. So I want to state here that I think we celebrate a different date. I think we celebrate the ratification of the first 7 articles of the Constitution as Constitution Day. I believe it's like September 11th or something is Constitution Day. That's not Constitution Day, people. Constitution Day is December 15th, 1791, I believe. because that's the day the Bill of Rights, a condition precedent to contract formation, was ratified. You can understand this if you've had at least 1 year of law school, because the first year of law school entails the classes of contract law, torts, which teaches you how to think about the law, and constitutional law and criminal law. And so if you've had these classes, you should be able to understand all these things I'm talking about, even Marbury versus Madison in constitutional law. But when I talk about contract law, when I say it's a condition precedent to contract formation, you'll understand what I mean. But that's what the Bill of Rights were. So the constitutional contract, I'll explain in the very next paragraph, but it's easier to understand the Constitution if you view it as a contract between the people and the government. You'll see what I'm talking about in a minute. But Constitution Day is the day the contract was formed. And if there's a condition precedent to contract formation, there's no contract until that is ratified. And that is the Bill of Rights. And that's December 15th. Oh, that's coming up. I should have read this on December 15th. No. Okay, no, December 12th. December 15th, 1791, the day the Bill of Rights, a condition precedent to contract formation, was ratified. In effect, any amendment made to the Constitution after its ratification on December 15th, 1791, the day the Bill of Rights, a condition precedent to contract formation, was ratified, is just another act of Congress, except far more dangerous because this act is attempting to change the supreme law of the land. The fact that this act of Congress has to be approved by state legislators, most of whom are aspiring to be Congresspeople, gives little confidence that this most important of all powers, the power to alter the Constitution, has all the checks it needs and all the checks intended from Article 5 alone. So Article 5 says when you amend the Constitution, either Congress or the state legislatures propose what the amendment is, and then Congress has to approve it, and each state legislator, or 7/5 of them or something like that, have to approve it. Just to show you every single amendment to the Constitution, out of all the amendments, just show you the power structure. Every amendment to the Constitution has started and originated in Congress, not the state legislatures. That just shows you that, the state legislatures, it's not a check, it's one check, but there's more to it than that. The fact that this act of Congress has to be approved by state legislators, most of whom are aspiring to be Congresspeople, gives little confidence that this most important of all powers, the power to alter the Constitution, has all the checks it needs and all the checks intended from Article 5 alone. What I'm saying is politicians are slime holes. And to say that only slime holes and no judges are allowed in this process can alter the Constitution is not the intention of the framers. They knew Congresspeople were slime holes a long time ago. There is no way they trusted changing the Constitution to legislators alone, in Congress and in state legislature. No way that the Supreme Court is not involved in the process of checking whether the proposed amendment and the ratified amendment is constitutional. Okay, for instance, what if Congress, which is really pretty much, they control the state legislatures to a certain degree. I mean, not 100%, but they have a big influence on them. So it's crazy to think the state legislatures are a check on Congress. Not. What if Congress wants to eliminate a right guaranteed in the Constitution? What if Congress wants to try to change our capitalistic Republican democracy to a socialist oligarchy where Congresspeople possess all the power? What if I told you Congress has already accomplished these things with amendments to the Constitution? Because that is what has happened, beginning with the Great Dred Scott Fraud of 1857. I'm going to show you later that immediately after the Constitution was ratified, there were two amendments made. Well, they called the Bill of Rights the amendments when they really should be called articles because they were part of the original contract. The first two happened like in 1808 or something like that. It's Amendment 11 and Amendment 12. And those two, I'll propose later, were in agreement with everybody. It was just tweaking the Constitution a little bit. It wasn't altering the material term of the contract. And those two I leave alone. I say those two were acceptable. And then, way later, after the framers of the Constitution and all the original people involved were dead, The next amendment came 60 years later. Amendment 13, after the Civil War. That's a red flag right there. We were running fine, people. And then you say, well, there was slavery. Well, it was on its way out. To end slavery, the first thing that had to happen was we had to take away an act of Congress called the Missouri Compromise. And that's what Dred Scott did. The case called Dred Scott is it rendered the Missouri Compromise as unconstitutional. And you better believe the gay Nazi assholes were not having it. They had a fit the whole way. They torpedoed Dred Scott, first of all, and then that led to the Civil War. That led to Amendment 13, which really just killed our democracy. The 13th Amendment gutted the Supreme Court powers because the 13th Amendment claimed to make slavery illegal when it actually did the opposite. And there was no way after the Dred Scott case that the Supreme Court could then come up and exert their power of judicial review over the 13th Amendment. Can you imagine after Dred Scott had completely obliterated the reputation of the Supreme Court and their power? Right after that, well, not right after, but after the Civil War, they come up with the 13th Amendment and they say it's to end slavery. It was just really quite a torpedoing of the Constitution, starting with this Dred Scott fraud and weakening the Supreme Court. It's the absolute worst time that the Supreme Court could exert its power for the first time over the amendment process. You couldn't do it on the 13th Amendment. Can you imagine the court, after this Dred Scott fraud was committed against them, trying to say, no, we have the power to strike down the 13th Amendment? It would have caused the complete collapse of our country. This way, it kept us limping along. And Congress kept doing unconstitutional amendments, 14, then 15, on its way to the crown queen of all the amendments, which is the 16th. That's the one they were after. They were just working their way up to it. They were weakening the powers of the Supreme Court. Congress was, all the way up to the 16th. And once they got that one, it's just been an oligarchy since then, controlled by Congress. We haven't been a democratic or a capitalistic democracy probably since the 13th Amendment, but really since the 16th Amendment. So they all have to come down. All those amendments have to and will. It's just a matter of time. So what is it going to be? Are we going to do it now, or are we going to wait another 200 years of corruption and BS and world wars? It's unsustainable. So I think it's going to have to be now. But are we going to do it through how many deaths and through another civil war, or are we going to let Trump do his thing and balance the trade imbalances and get us going and make it a soft landing into inevitable world peace? Just depends, but I'm thinking it's going to be the latter. Anyway, a helpful way to view the Constitution is that it is a contract between the people and the government, capital letters, the people in capital, and the government in capital letters, where the government is made up of 6 distinct entities. So this is a contract between the people and 6 government entities that I call the government. And these 6 entities are: 1, the federal legislature, which we call Congress; 2, the state legislatures, of which we now currently have 50; 3, the federal executive branch, which is headed by the president; and 4, the state executives, which are the governors, the state executive branches, which are led by the governors; 5, the federal judiciary, which is headed by the Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court, and the state courts. This is confusing, by the way. The highest court of the state is called the Supreme Court. So we have to keep that in mind when I say the New York Supreme Court could be very confusing. Actually, I think the New York Supreme Court is the lowest court. It's the lowest court? Yeah, just the names of these courts can be very confusing. But it's the U.S. Supreme Court is the federal branch, and the state courts have Supreme Courts that are the state Supreme Courts. The highest courts in there. And there is a Supreme Court somewhere. I believe it's in New York, where the Supreme Court is the first court you go to when you're filing something. Like, you go to the Supreme Court of New York, and it's like going to our Superior Court here. Like, the courthouse down the street is the Supreme Court. So it can get confusing, but it's okay. So anyway, those are the 6 different entities, but they're all the government. An offer is made to the people by the government in the first 7 articles of the Constitution. In consideration is an important word in contract law. In consideration, it's a quid pro quo, this for that. What are you trading? It's in consideration for the people getting to live under a Republican democracy, a capitalistic Republican democracy. I had a hard time naming these things. Republican versus Democrat versus democracy versus capitalist versus, but I'm just calling it, I think people call it a Republican democracy, which is what leads to the sustained world peace. So we'll see, whatever. I'm not sure what to name all this stuff. And the offer is accepted by the people with a condition precedent to contract formation. And that is that 10 amendments that ferret out the terms of the original contract that guaranteed no ex post facto laws, no bills of attainder, and no titles of nobility. A lot of people think there were no personal rights listed in the original articles, but there were. There were 3 of them. They were no bills of attainder, and I'll go through that later what those are, no ex post facto laws, and no titles of nobility. Sometimes there isn't a change to a contract. It's just known as ferreting out the details of what the contract is. But in this case, it was enough of a concern to say, no, these articles, this contract is void until we accept the Bill of Rights, which are just really detailing what's already in the original contract. But it's an important detail, so important that unless the other side accepts it, this contract is void. So that's the Bill of Rights. It says the people said, nope, sorry, government. Your first 7 articles we accept, but it's almost a counter offer in a way, except it's ferreting out what's already in there. So it's really just called the condition precedent, which says until this condition is met, and once this condition is met, then the contract comes into formation. So it's unfair to say that Constitution Day is the day the offer was made. It was a wonderful offer, but it wasn't accepted until the Bill of Rights was added as articles, but we call them amendments. It's not really amendments. It doesn't change anything. It ferrets out. It puts in detail the terms of the original contract. And there are arguments, by the way. There are some people who say, like Gorsuch, for instance, he says you don't need the 10 amendments if you're following the fundamental rights. But we kind of do for now because, it needs to be written out. I think he's a believer in the fundamental rights, but I think that it was good that we wrote them out because they happen to be correct, especially the 9th Amendment, because we haven't used the 9th Amendment. The 9th Amendment says we're listing out these rights that we believe are the fundamental laws of peaceful self-governing, but we don't know them all. That's what the framers were saying. There are some out there that we're positive we haven't been able to identify, and just because we didn't list them in the Bill of Rights doesn't mean they don't exist. So we're leaving it up to the court, the United States Supreme Court, to, in the future, if they come up, they should be able to spot these fundamental rights that we haven't listed under the 9th Amendment. And since then, if you take a constitutional law class, it's pathetic. They don't know what the 9th Amendment is. They just throw it out. The scholars, quote unquote, the smart people who are freaking idiots up to this point. When people file constitutional challenges and things, there's a certain pattern that they have to use or they've used in the past, and I just blow that whole thing up. I don't even use that. They cite, for instance, the 14th Amendment, the equality clause in the 14th Amendment, because apparently the Constitution doesn't have the equality clause. When it does, it has it in 4 different places, and I'll mention that later. So I cite those clauses as the equality clauses. And I cite, instead of citing some known precedent or anything, if it's a right that hasn't been recognized, like the right of a child not to be hit, the right of any human not to be hit, but especially a child, is a 9th Amendment right. The right not to be owned by another human was not specifically listed in the Constitution. So that's where the Supreme Court must come in. It's the first right under the 9th Amendment, I'm pretty sure the Supreme Court should do when they strike down the 13th Amendment as unconstitutional. This is what people call a living constitution, which it is. And the living constitution is the 9th Amendment. When fascist Nazis, usually on the conservative side, say, oh, it's not in the Constitution, so therefore it isn't the right. Like, you freaking moron. On the Supreme Court especially. I can't believe it. When that comes out of somebody's mouth, they're either gay Nazi assholes or they're non-gay dumbass morons being controlled by gay Nazi assholes. Of course it's in the Constitution. It's up to you. It's up to us as humans. It's up to you as the 9 smartest lawyers in the country on the Supreme Court to protect our rights and to identify which ones those are, because there are fundamental human rights. It's like you're trying to figure out the E equals MC squared in physics. Okay, that's what you guys are supposed to be doing. You're supposed to be the Einsteins of law and figure out what other fundamental rights are out there and ferreting them out and listing them under your powers under the 9th Amendment. Okay, and I already suggested some. The Supreme Court doesn't have to suggest them. The people can suggest them, but you have to argue them, and we have to get it right. Because if we don't, it's going to happen anyway. We're going to get there. It's going to be 100 years later. We're going to eventually get it right as the human race, or just annihilate ourselves or something. Become extinct, okay? Or just, war ourselves to death. The 2 parties of this contract are confirmed. It's really neat when you start thinking of it this way. Then things start emerging that show a symmetry and show how beautiful it is on a higher level, how beautiful our Constitution is, and how all other countries of the world are going to have to follow something very similar. Because whatever Constitution hits on the fundamental laws of peaceful self-governing, I call them, but whatever ones actually hit upon them are it. You can't function as a government otherwise, at least not long term. Financially, it's unsustainable, and you're going to have to follow whatever. It's not following the U.S., it's following whatever the fundamental laws are, and we were the first to get there. We actually operated under them closest to anybody for 100 years, more than any other country. So that's why we're going to always be in the lead financially, especially once we strike down the 16th Amendment. The 16th Amendment has actually funded all these other forms of government across the world. And once we stop doing that, they're going to fail. And that's what Trump is doing. When he is doing trade imbalances and he's trying to level them out, what he's doing is he's stopping us from subsidizing all these socialists, communists, whatever it is. It's all fascism. It's all different forms of fascism. It's just different stages of fascism. So when you say socialist Sweden, well, socialist Sweden couldn't stay in power unless it was getting $7 billion a year from us in the form of trade imbalances from the 16th Amendment. So this is a worldwide fraud. The 16th Amendment was a worldwide fraud. It was not supposed to happen this way. We were supposed to lead the world, not subsidize socialism all over the world from all these swamps, all these gay Nazi assholes from all these countries. Okay, that's what we have, and those are the people who are going against Trump right now. So if you're against Trump, you are for slave labor in China, and you're for fascism everywhere else. Fascism and socialism and communism, whatever you want to call it, it's all the same thing. So you either have a capitalistic democracy or you have fascism. There's no other choices. So the 2 parties are confirmed by the preamble to the offer, which restricts the people and their powers. In other words, it says the duties of the people. It restricts us. It really does. It says you have to live under these laws. So it restricts the people and appropriately mentions the people as in we the people. That's in the preamble to the offer, which is the first 7 articles of the Constitution. It begins with we the people. And also the preamble to the condition precedent to contract formation, in other words, the Bill of Rights, which restricts the government and appropriately mentions the government as in, and as extending the ground of public confidence in the government. So in other words, the parties to the contract is already laid out in the preambles, the government and the people. There is some confusion historically. There is some confusion that the state legislatures should be considered the people in this contract. But that is only because it was state legislators who, being natural lawmakers and the only ones available at the time, since Congress had not yet been formed, wrote most of the constitutional contract and had to represent both the people. This is kind of half-truth because there was something called the Congress of the Confederate. We tried a constitution and it immediately failed because the power structures were not right and because it did not protect the fundamental laws of peaceful self-governing, specifically the right to no taxation without representation. But that was the most important one. Once we got the tax thing right and the power structure right, that held. But you could tell we actually attempted a constitution that didn't work. There is some confusion that the state legislatures should be considered the people in this contract, but that is only because it was state legislators who, being natural lawmakers and the only ones available at the time since Congress, the current form of Congress, had not been formed, wrote most of the constitutional contract and had to represent both the people and the government as they did so. So here you are. You're a state legislator, and you're trying to write this contract up, and you are both a people and individually and a part of the government because you're working as a part of the government. So you're both of these people at the same time. However, once the contract was formed, state legislators and the state legislatures, the legislator is the person and the legislature is the whole body of people, fell squarely into the government camp. This is something that's very critical, and we don't do. When you're doing civics classes in high school, we need to get this straight. All this stuff civics classes are great, but they don't, we need more of them, but they need to cover this properly. And they need to cover contract law, by the way, which is the best law. This is my absolute favorite class. It's because it's the most fair of all the laws. Contract law, as it is practiced in the United States, or as it is taught, I'm not sure how much it is practiced now because it's so slimy, but contract law is the closest thing we have right now to peaceful self-governing. The laws there, they're very fair in a lot of ways. It's amazing how fair it is. It's like if it feels unfair, if it feels not right when you're doing a contract and something doesn't feel right intuitively, there's a law out there saying there's something wrong there. In contract law, it's amazing how you just use your intuition. I would suggest all high school civics classes or all college, whatever, you guys should all teach that. In Article 5, the people allow the government, Congress and state legislatures, that's the government, to make unilateral modifications to the contract. But obviously, the people are not naive enough to allow unilateral material modifications, meaning very important ones, which would be unconscionable anyway. That's another term, unconscionable in contract law. That's every one of these words means something in contract law. I'm not just spewing them out, which would be unconscionable anyway, even if they did. It is therefore strongly implied that only non-material unilateral modifications are allowed, and that the Supreme Court has the final say on what is a material change and what is not a material change in any contract dispute between the people and the government, which is what the amendment process is. It's a contract dispute involving the constitutional contract, i.e., in other words, the Supreme Court has the power of judicial review over constitutional amendments. All right. Article 5 itself offers evidence that there are two different kinds of modifications, small ones that are allowed and large material ones that are not allowed, and that for two clauses in particular, Article 1, Section 9, Clauses 1 and 4, absolutely no changes are allowed, not even small ones, until 1808. Article 5 states that the government may amend the Constitution, quote, provided that no amendment which may be made prior to the year 1808 shall in any manner, and I put it in bold, big or small, those are my words, affect the first and fourth clauses in the 9th section of the first article, end quote. Parentheses in bold lettering added by me. And in one case in particular, it is not quite obvious if it is a material term or not, but the people wanted to make sure the Supreme Court and the government knew it was definitely a material term that was not to be changed. So Article 5 follows the above instructions with, quote, and that no state without its consent shall be deprived of its equal suffrage in the Senate. Meaning the Senate is made up of two people from each state, no matter how big the state is. So Wyoming has 2 representatives in the Senate, and New York has 2, regardless of size. And a lot of people argue this and say, oh, why? That doesn't seem fair. And it's just like, no, it's just the balance of power, and it's perfect. And it works out very well. It works out very well, actually, if it's done correctly. Anyway, that heavy restrictions on changing the Constitution should be applied to Article 5 also comes from the fact that the Constitution, despite the common saying that it is the great experiment, is really nothing of the sort. The Articles of Confederation were the true great experiment. That was the first Constitution we had that failed almost immediately. The Articles of Confederation were the true great experiment, and the Constitution is the highly refined, highly evolved result of all the mistakes and lessons learned from it. The well thought out balance of power among all 7 entities in this contract. Whenever we talk about balance of powers, we're always saying, oh, it's the checks and balances. Checks and balances. And then what do they mention in civics class? Checks and balances. Well, there are 3 branches of government and they check and balance each other. It's like, no, they do. But the most important check is the check that the people have against all 3 of these. That's the most important one that isn't mentioned in civics class. They always say there's the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch, and that's all, people. There's no other entity involved here. It's the most important one. It's the people. So these 3 branches check each other, but then the people have a check on all 3 of these. We check the executive branch by votes. We check the legislative branch by votes. But the most important check we have by votes is against the judicial branch. And the way we do that is by votes, again, except it's on a jury. And so we have a right to vote, and we also have a right to be on a jury, which, and I'll mention this later, there's no right to be on a jury actually listed out. It's our 9th Amendment right to be on a jury. So right now we're practicing something called voir dire, which is voir fascist, Nazi pieces of shit who came up with this idea. It says, oh, we're going to make it fair. So we get lawyers to come in and pick and choose the jury. So we can knock you off the jury just because you're black, which is still happening, people. Slavery was not taken out. We still have slavery, people. Because you could be knocked off a jury, the most important voting you're going to do. You can knock out voting in elections all you want. The most important vote as a person is when you get on a jury, because that's deciding who's guilty, but it's also changing laws. That vote is gone. And that is not mentioned when you say checks and balances. There is no check on our judiciary. There's no check because the people don't vote. The lawyers are from both sides and the government decide who gets to be on the jury. We do have a fundamental 9th Amendment right to be on a jury. So voir dire needs to go, people. It needs to be a true cross-section of the population, and whoever can vote can be on a jury, and you're not allowed to knock them off the jury just because they're black, which is exactly what happens, or just because Google has given you information that they're a certain political leaning. That's what they're doing now, by the way. That's what the slime holes are doing. They pay Google, they pay Facebook, they pay these people. The swamps go through the DMV, and then that's how they rig the juries. They just have a complete profile on every person who's on Facebook, on Google, and then you could rig the jury that way. You could say what their political leanings are, and then you give that information to the swamp hole lawyers who go in and pick and choose their jury. And I've had so much evidence of this happening on my cases. The statistics of what comes up on my jury pools are just, it's statistically proven just on my cases that it's highly unlikely that the juries were not rigged. They were absolutely rigged every time. Hello, everybody. Happy Wednesday, December 14th, 2022. This is Music of the Night, part 11, and it's 5 a.m. in the morning, and I got to finish this last one. Before we do this, let's do what we usually do. Some house cleaning. So I wanted to say in part 9, I started to talk about civics classes and how they should change when they're talking about checks and balances. Right now, civics classes and law schools and everybody talk about checks and balances as being between the 3 branches of government, the legislative, the executive, and the judiciary, and how this balance of power helps put a check on corruption and on power. And they always forget the most important check on power of all of it, and that's the other entity involved, which is the people, the other side of the constitutional contract. There's the people, and then there's the government. And when you're talking about the checks and balances, they're only talking about the government part self-checking themselves. But that's a self-check, and that works. That's a good check. But the real check is the people's check on the other side of the contract, the people checking the government. In part 9, I said the most important check against the judiciary was the voting on the jury. And that is taken out by voir dire, where it is a fundamental right, actually, for people to be on a jury, as well as to have a jury. So there are rights listed that we have a jury, but not to be on a jury. So far, the only check mentioned against the legislative and executive branches is voting. Like we say, oh, the people check the government by voting, which is the least powerful check you could have against the legislative and executive branches. So I wanted to say that I missed an opportunity to state this when I started to state the checks against the legislative and executive branches. For the legislative branch, the most important check is what's called pro se constitutional challenges to the laws they put out. A legislature, either the state or a local city or the federal government, the Congress, will put out a law, and the best check against that law are the people being able to file a lawsuit against that as being unconstitutional under the First Amendment right. So the First Amendment protects the people's right to petition the government to complain about that law, and the Supreme Court has the ultimate say whether that law is constitutional. The Supreme Court has judicial review over that law under the First Amendment, and that's the most important check against the legislative power. And people say it's the judicial branch that has the check over that, but it's the people actually instigating that. It's the people's power through the court system, yes, but the people have to file that lawsuit, and the judicial branch has to take it up. That's the origin of that power. That you don't just have the judiciary working in a vacuum. They're working on what the people tell them to work on. They are the referees in that case. Yes, they do have that power to do it, but that power ultimately comes from the people filing the petition in the first place. And those petitions nowadays are just, this entire part 10 was me showing a lawsuit, and I showed 50 lawsuits. I filed many lawsuits before that, and any lawsuit I file as a pro se litigant or as a powerless person, they're just completely crapped on when they're the most important filings you can do. So that needs to change in civics classes. You need to talk about the pro se constitutional challenge, and we will in the future, and you'll mostly be citing me in the future. People say, who am I addressing when I'm writing stuff? A lot of times I'm addressing my muses, my current day muses, but ultimately I'm addressing school children from 100 years from now. So hi everybody, it's me, and I specifically wrote this for you, and I'm glad you're looking at it now, and as I'm sure you will be, because everything I'm writing is the premier explanation for how Holocaust happened, and the premier explanation at the time for how we can change and what went wrong. And one of the things that went wrong is the check against the judicial branch, which I already discussed. The voir dire needs to go. Voir dire is jury rigging by the government, and it allows other kind of sinister jury rigging to occur. So all that stuff needs to go. The fundamental right to be on a jury. And then the check against the legislative branch is the pro se, meaning no lawyer, constitutional challenge. It's a specific kind of lawsuit. It doesn't mean I have a right to sue Microsoft for free or my neighbor for free. I can't sue these people for free, but I can file a complaint against a law for free. And the Supreme Court said I could. They're just not following the law right now. It's just so corrupt right now. And I've proven that in my 49 anti-mask lawsuits that I filed in federal courts across the entire country in 47 states. And I have that in the last tutorial. So the third check against the third branch, the executive branch, the Fourth Amendment has been misinterpreted and misread to say that the court can decide what a reasonable search and seizure is. And that's not what the Fourth Amendment says. The Fourth Amendment gives it's called a civil cause of action, meaning I have a right to file a cause of action, which is negligence, against the government. So there are many roadblocks that have been put in place to knock this check out as well. And one of them is people say the 11th Amendment says I can't sue my government. It's like bullshit. I can't sue my government. That's made up. And the other one is if there is a lawsuit, the reasonable standard has to be decided by a judge, when that's not true. It's a jury. So the Fourth Amendment to the United States Constitution says, this is what it says. It says, if I am mistreated by a police officer, the executive branch, in any way, I can file a lawsuit in civil court, not criminal court, in civil court for money damages against the government who treated me negligently under the cause of action of negligence, which requires a reasonable standard. Like, was the police being unreasonable in their search or seizure of me, in the way they handled me, searches and seizures? So the Fourth Amendment gives me a right to reasonable searches and seizures. And in any court of law anywhere in the United States, if there is something that needs to be decided as being reasonable, it's never a judge that decides that. It should never, it should never be a judge. It's always a jury of my peers that decides what's reasonable, not a freaking judge. who's on the side of the cop. He's the government. So the government can't decide what's reasonable when they're being sued for what is reasonable. It's the people who decide what is reasonable, and that has never been done. If you go through criminal law, it's the biggest piece of shit law class you will ever do. I have trouble passing the bar because I hate learning all this shit because it's bullshit, the whole thing. Criminal law is in shambles right now, and it has been for a very long time for this reason. One of the biggest reasons. When you learn all about the Fourth Amendment, you learn 20 billion different lawsuits where a Supreme Court justice said, oh, if he had been an inch further to the left, it would have been an unreasonable search. And they're trying to apply this to the entire country. Oh, if he had farted to the right instead of to the left while he was reading him this, it would have been a reasonable search. Versus, it is so stupid and micromanaged to the point of being useless. What has to happen, and what should have happened all this time, and we've wasted all this time, is the law system should have created its own customs and its own local customs, what the local juries wanted and what the local juries considered reasonable and unreasonable. And these things should be deciding. It's called, what is that called? I'm sorry, now I'm forgetting all this other stuff. It's when the law is either written or you're doing it by custom. What is the matter with me? These words used to roll off my tongue when I came out of law school, and I haven't been in law mode for such a long time. When the court system and the juries and the trials decide the law. It's like the customary law versus the law that's written. And there's such an easy word for it. And everybody, all these lawyers are like shouting it at me right now. And I can't think of it for some reason.
Dear past me, this is future you, and the phrase you are looking for is the common law. This is in contrast to laws that are made by the legislative branch, which is called the statutory law.
Anyway, so these are the three checks the people have against the government entities, each branch. And that they've all been torpedoed so far by the Nazis. And not accidentally. These were taken out a long time ago. So now they teach you in civics class, oh, here's your check, we vote. And I mentioned it before. Really? So the reason these checks are very important is because they're specific for your local law and they can happen immediately. All of them. I'm on a jury, immediately you have a response. If I'm on a jury, immediately I could file a petition, immediately if a law is really bad, and immediately I could file another lawsuit against the executive branch if I've immediately been. Immediately he left the synagogue. Oh, this is my immediately man. Mark is hilarious. And when I was in jail, when you read Mark, this guy said, and then you notice it, you say, this guy says immediately a lot. And then it just becomes like when you notice somebody like me who says like a lot, or you know, I'm sure I say a lot of stuff, drives you crazy. Once you see that, you just can't unsee it, and you laugh every time. There's like 50 million immediatelys.
She calls to speak to me. I freeze immediately.
So when you see an immediately in Matthew, you know it was added by the person who's doing Mark. It's like there's an immediately guy. There's a parentheses guy. There's an immediately guy. There's a steadfast love guy. There's a barrel guy. And, you know, these people, they have a certain style, and you start to pick it up, and then when you start adding intent, and you could pick up on it. And I'm gonna eventually have the entire original and every single edit done to the originals at a certain time. I hope I'm going to get that all mapped out. But if not, it's fine. It's still fun. And their solution is, the current Nazi propaganda kind of narrative is, oh, if you don't like the way you were treated by the police officer, or you don't like a law that's unconstitutional that sends you away to a concentration camp, or if you want to be on a jury that decides that somebody's guilty or not, or whether the behavior of the cop was reasonable or not, the jury's going to decide that. That's the most important vote you could do in your life. It's very powerful because there you're only one of 12. You're not one of 50 million or whatever it is when you're voting in a big election. But they say, oh, if you don't like that treatment, you could vote him out of office. I mean, seriously, people, you could vote him out of office in 5 years, in 4 years, in 2 years. Just vote him out of office and put another slimehole in their place that does the same thing. To tell you that you have the vote and therefore it's a democracy is the biggest joke of this century. And dear school children 100 years from now. I am not kidding. You have to live right now to realize that that is what they're saying. And this is what they've been saying for 100 years. You know it inherently, and you're laughing at us for what we're saying, but they're saying it now. They're telling me in civics class, in the same class you're taking, they're telling me that the best check against the government is I get to vote them out of office in 5 years if I don't like their behavior. Because that's how bad it's become. We're completely ignoring the Fourth Amendment. We're using voir dire to let the government choose who the juries are for that vote. And we're also completely ignoring pro se constitutional challenges to the laws. They're ignoring my lawsuits, which are the most important. And all the lawsuits going on right now that they're considering important is between government entities. It's just the government over there fighting between swamps. That's all it is. Or corporations, they're all one big swamp. Oh, Microsoft sues this, or the government sues this, or that state sues that state, while I am just completely being ignored, while I have the most important filings here concerning COVID, considering everything. My lawsuit should have gone straight to the Supreme Court over COVID. And they don't do it because these are the core issues that need to be answered, and they don't want to do that. They're just doing distractions. Everybody's just being distracted by the media and by these stupid lawsuits while it's just all shadow government going on. And this is a fascist system, and that's what happens. And that's what's going on, but we're going to get back to it. In part 9, I was starting to state checks against the government that should be in civics classes, and I completely forgot the Fourth Amendment right to sue them for unreasonable searches in a court of law, civil law, over money, and I forgot pro se constitutional challenges. I just wanted to put it in one place. If you're ready, come and get it. The well thought out balance of power among all 7 entities in the contract, the people and the 6 parts of the government, are not to be tampered with lightly. In trying to determine what is a material term of the contract that could not be modified, 2 things should be considered. Okay, this is me here. 1, does the amendment, the proposed amendment, grant a right or power to one of the 7 entities, the 6 parts of the government, and then the people? These are the 7 entities in the contract. Does the amendment grant a right or power to one of the 7 entities that is not granted in the contract originally? Is there a new power coming up? And 2, does the amendment restrict a right or power already conferred on one of the 7 entities in the contract? So you have to see what the power structure is. And if the amendment is coming in specifically going after a power or adding a power, it is void. Okay? If the answer is yes to either question, i.e., in other words, the amendment creates or destroys power, the amendment is probably trying to modify a material term and violates the constitutional contract. At the other end of the spectrum, we do not want legislators to misuse the amendment process as just another legislative tool to try to make popular legislation veto-proof for future legislators, thereby making the Constitution look like scribbles in a laboratory notebook or a rough draft that some editor writes all over with a red pen, like quote-unquote, oh, we should make alcohol super duper illegal. Let's make an amendment. And then, a few years later, they find out that's not a fundamental law to peaceful self-governing. And they find out very quickly because of all the corruption. And then they say, oh, never mind, that was a mistake. And then they repeal the amendment. Okay, that amendment, we shouldn't have had to repeal the amendment. That should have been struck down immediately by the court. So we didn't have to go through that process. Here's a second criterion, other than asking if the amendment tries to change a material term, is to ask the question that bars frivolous or trivial amendments at the other end of the spectrum. And it is this, quote, is this not something that Congress could accomplish with just an act without an amendment? So they could have just written an act that says alcohol is illegal throughout the entire country. And then they could have found out through practice or through arguments at the Supreme Court, if anybody wants to challenge that law, whatever it is, they would find out that way whether this was a correct law or not through an amendment, which is very difficult to change. So you're using the amendment process to make something super veto-proof just makes it that much harder to undo it if it's the incorrect law, like the 16th Amendment. That needs to go, and it's taken 100 years of corruption to figure it out. A cursory pass over the first few amendments using these criteria briefly suggests the following outline notations. Should the Supreme Court assert its rightful powers to review all of them? And they should. These are things that I've been saying that I've developed in law school and before law school and just through experience and going through the criminal justice system with 5 false arrests and over a year of jail time. Through all those 5 arrests, I've had a year total of jail time, and I've spent every holiday in jail except Martin Luther King holiday. So let's just knock on wood. Where's some wood somewhere. There's plastic. Oh, here's wood. It's a little plank I have for the cat so that he could walk through the car very easily. I believe it's MLK looking over me, and the black people will have a fit over this, but it's just like I had an argument in one of my Nicoliokis to let me use the word boo, and it's the same. Let me have Martin Luther King, please. It's the only holiday I didn't spend in jail, and I believe it's not an accident. I think he's protecting me. He says a lot of great stuff, and I like him. And I think he likes me. Okay, Amendment 11. The framers of the Constitution were there at the time, pretty much. So this is what happens, but we've misinterpreted it since. The Supreme Court, this is what happened. The Supreme Court did not want original jurisdiction over cases between citizens of one state and the government of another state. I'm a citizen of California and I want to sue the state of Arizona for some reason. The Constitution says that if this happens, the Supreme Court itself, when it says original jurisdiction, it means the Supreme Court becomes like the first court, like your court down the street. They actually hear the case. They sit up there like a judge in a regular case and hear the case. It's called original jurisdiction. It's not a review of the cases beneath it, but it's original jurisdiction, and it takes a long time to run a case. You have to get jurors, and you have to do all this stuff, and doing trials takes a long time. This clogged up the Supreme Court so much. Very early on, they discovered that the Supreme Court did not want original jurisdiction over those cases anymore. It was just too much. The framers, when they did this, they were trying to make sure that there was no unfair stuff going on. So that's why the Supreme Court came in when it was between states. So when you see the Constitution, it lists out very specific types of cases that the Supreme Court must hear originally, as if they were a trial court. And it listed out, if a citizen of one state wants to sue the government in the other state, that would be original jurisdiction in the Supreme Court. And that was just flooded. That was just too much. That was just too many cases, and it just bogged down the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court very quickly realized they do not want original jurisdiction over cases between citizens of one state and the government of another state, probably because it was unnecessarily clogging things up and is not the most efficient use of the Supreme Court resources. So here's the question. Well, okay, I'm going to do it very quickly. It does not appear to be a material change to the Constitution. And 2, it is expressly listed in the Constitution under cases for diversity jurisdiction that the Supreme Court has original jurisdiction over. So Congress cannot just pass a law to take care of the problem because it's in the Constitution. You have to amend the Constitution in this case. So it really passed both my criteria. The amendment is constitutional, but only as long as it is interpreted in this narrow way. If the amendment is interpreted the way it is interpreted modernly, which is that all governments have a right not to be sued by some made-up notion called sovereign immunity. What the hell is that? Sovereign immunity is a fascist, gay, Nazi creation, people. As soon as you hear it, it needs to be thrown out the window. And the person saying it is a Nazi or a non-gay dumbass moron. So if you hear the word sovereign immunity, it's just made up by Nazis, and it needs to go. And they cite the 11th Amendment, which is not what the 11th Amendment was for. It's not to create sovereign immunity. It most definitely violates the rule that an amendment can neither create nor destroy a right or power in that case. They just created the power. This amendment, if it's interpreted the way it's modernly interpreted, is unconstitutional and must go. It doesn't have to go, because another thing the Supreme Court could do instead of striking down the amendment is interpreting it properly. And in this case, that needs to be done. So the Supreme Court either strikes down the 11th Amendment, which I doubt they're going to do because, they don't want original jurisdiction now, especially. It would be unattainable to do all those cases. So anyway, this modern interpretation creates a new power for the government that is non-existent in the Constitution, and also takes away a First Amendment right from the people to petition the government for grievances, i.e. file lawsuits in a court of law, presumably including grievances against the government. Not presumably, I mean, that's what the whole purpose of the First Amendment was so the people can file complaints against government. Okay, those are constitutional challenges. This was meant for a citizen of one state not to sue the government of another state. And the modern interpretation has fallen so far from the original that they interpreted it as saying a citizen of this state, of your own state, you can't sue your own state government. Where the hell did they can't, it's such a stretch. Like, it's such a stretch. That's not what it says, people. Go read the freaking stuff. Read. You just pulled it out of their asses. Finally, this modern interpretation takes away a Fourth Amendment right from the people to sue the government in civil court for unreasonable searches and seizures, since the only entity allowed in any court of law to determine a reasonable standard is a jury of peers. The judge doesn't decide what is reasonable, and if they do, there's something wrong going on, which is what happens in criminal law when you appeal a case and they try to decide what a reasonable search is. That's what the Supreme Court has been doing. It's the most ridiculous laws on the planet is when the Supreme Court decides what a reasonable search is, when it's up to the people. We've misinterpreted the Fourth Amendment, and I'm getting way ahead of myself. This is all in my websites, all this stuff. I talked about the criminal stuff, and you have to go through the system to do this. So it's, once again, living my best life, but you have to really pay your dues first, like be falsely arrested 5 times by the current vice president, Kamala Harris. This modern interpretation, it's taking away rights and it's giving power. So this is doubly struck down as modernly interpreted. The Supreme Court needs to and will in the future come out. They have to, because this is inevitable. It's inevitable sustained world peace. Amendment 12. This amendment changes the way the Electoral College chooses the president and vice president, and probably best represents what the amendment process was created for, which is to tweak the constitutional contract in non-material ways if and when problems become apparent after the ratification. In this case, problems that arose in the process of electing the president and vice president. 1. It does not create or destroy any powers granted to any of the 7 entities in the Constitution. And 2. It is changing the way the elections are run in the Constitution, so Congress cannot resolve the issue with just an act. Amendment 12 is constitutional for changing a non-material term that cannot be changed by Congress alone with an act. Of course, when you're reviewing this, there's going to be long, drawn-out arguments, but this is the crux of the arguments, I believe. But what do I know? There's a lot of this stuff that has to be ferreted out because these are fundamental laws. And it's not just one person's opinion. We can't put it up to vote. Can't stand that. People don't understand that there are fundamental laws that can't be voted on. You could vote on it all you want, but it doesn't make it right or wrong just because a majority of people say it is. Okay, let's vote on let's put up to vote what the laws of gravity are. Duh. I mean, it just doesn't work that way, people. Amendment 13. If the Constitution guarantees a right to own slaves, this amendment destroys that right and is therefore unconstitutional. Fortunately, the Constitution in no way guarantees the right to own slaves. And I went through this. That was the whole first 30 pages of this. By the way, that hasn't been answered by the Supreme Court yet, and they must do that. They will in the future. They have to. The framers were careful never to use the word slaves or slavery in the Constitution for this reason, and only referred to slaves the same way they referred to prisoners, in fact, as unfree people, implying they may be free someday like prisoners. They say slavery was mentioned in the Constitution by unfree people. No, that mentions prisoners too. And that's a count of 3/5 of the vote. If you're in jail or you're a prisoner or you're a slave or you're otherwise unfree, you're counted only as 3/5 for the vote in the apportionment. That's all it is. That's not 3/5 of a person. That's just all fake news, people. And I'm not going to go into it. Just you either want to learn or you don't. And I can't help you if you don't. The right to trade in slaves was protected for only 20 years as a necessary evil to get the Constitution ratified. But Congress certainly had the power to abolish all slave trade and therefore abolish the right to own slaves after the first 20 years. And they did, by the way, immediately. Congress passed a law immediately that abolished the slave trade as soon as they could, according to the Constitution. It's not like a majority of people did not want to abolish slavery. They did. They were just taking the steps, but they had the gay Nazi assholes, and they're hard. They're worse than vampires to stop people. As you could say, I mean, I'm trying to educate non-gay dumbass morons to see exactly where the source of all this stuff is coming from. Okay, and it's like constant attacks against the Constitution. All right, but now it's coming to a head now. Okay, the clauses in the Constitution restricting Congress from passing laws granting the titles of nobility or from passing bills of attainder restrict Congress from treating one set of humans better than others or worse than others, respectively, for arbitrary reasons. For example, being white makes you a noble person who can vote and own land, or being black means you can be owned by another human and punished by them at will with bill of attainder laws. So laws saying only whites could be citizens and vote and only blacks could be owned by other humans and struck by them were unconstitutional because we had bills of attainder and these are mentioned in the original Constitution. So it's just a matter of what your definition is. There's more evidence of slavery not being a right than there is of it being a right in the Constitution, really. Finally, the framers set up the Constitution so that the Supreme Court could recognize the right not to be owned by another human as a fundamental right protected under the Ninth Amendment, once again providing evidence that there is no express right to own another human in the Constitution, and if anything, quite the opposite. With no express right to own slaves in the Constitution, Amendment 13 is frivolous, and its purpose can be accomplished by a simple act of Congress. It is therefore unconstitutional for being frivolous, except the part that says slavery is okay in certain circumstances, which it does say. 13th Amendment says slavery is okay, but only in certain circumstances. And guess what that is? It's when you go to prison. Go watch The 13th. It's a documentary. Ava DuVernay. Oh my God, she blocked me so fast on Twitter. I love you, baby. She comes from Long Beach, I think, too. Anyway, Ava, I love you. And I didn't mean to insult you so badly. I came in hot on Twitter with her. But, so what? I came in hot on Kelly all the time, and she's never blocked me. Maybe she just doesn't block anybody, but I appreciate that. My muse. But Ava is my muse, too. I mean, she's great. But she, when you look at the documentary, she got it all wrong. It's all, against Trump in the end. And it's just very vague that way in the end. It's just to be against Trump, just to be against Trump. Just because everybody is. I mean, come on. You can do better than that. But the whole idea of the 13th Amendment just switching slavery from slavery to putting blacks in prison, that's the Black Holocaust. We're still in it, people. And Trump is trying to end the Black Holocaust, and he will end the Black Holocaust against the wishes of black people, which is fine. It's going to happen with or without it. I just wish they could be involved in this, making it faster. With no express right to own slaves in the Constitution, Amendment 13 is frivolous, and its purpose can be accomplished by a simple act of Congress. It is therefore unconstitutional for being frivolous, except the part that says slavery is okay in certain circumstances. Such an exception is unconstitutional, since it destroys a fundamental human right not to be owned by another human under any circumstances, as protected under the Ninth Amendment. Note that this argument seems circular. The Supreme Court recognizes a fundamental human right under the Ninth Amendment that retroactively deems part of the 13th Amendment unconstitutional. But that is perfectly consistent with the idea that the Supreme Court has the supreme power of judicial review over any changes to the Constitution without a statute of limitations, meaning they could do it anytime they want, 200 years later if they want. And that this power is highly prejudicial against modification, so that amendments can and should be struck down liberally. It shouldn't be so easy to pass a law that says all alcohol is banned everywhere. This is just ridiculous, people. These are the fundamental laws of peaceful self-governing. They shouldn't be changed so easily. They actually weren't changed easily. It took the Great Dred Scott Fraud first against the Supreme Court to first weaken the Supreme Court, and then they had to, manufacture the Civil War and then come up with the 13th Amendment, then the 14th, and then the 15th. It's just weakening. Every one of these is a blow to the Supreme Court and to our Constitution. And finally, they got to the 16th. So it took quite a while to get to the 16th, but they did it, and it needs to go. It is fair to ask, what would be the point of striking down a frivolous amendment like the 13th Amendment now after so many years? That's the question. I am not African American, but I do not think I could stand it if I were black living under the 13th Amendment, where I am told to celebrate the 13th Amendment because I'm supposed to be happy that a group of powerful white lawmakers came together and said it was okay for me not to be owned by another human anymore. Really? This is not for another human to decide, people, white or black. To not be owned by another human is a God-given right, and I use God here, but I mean it is a fundamental right I received at birth that is fully protected under the 9th Amendment to the Constitution, as intended by the framers. It is not up to politically biased elected legislators to grant me this right, as if it is theirs to give and theirs to take away, if they so choose. It is up to impartial, learned scholars of the Supreme Court to state in a reasonable and official manner that humans in history have been very ignorant up to this point in not recognizing a fundamental 9th Amendment right not to be owned by another human, a right that every human was born with since the beginning of time, just like all the other rights in the Constitution, including in the Bill of Rights and including under the 9th Amendment that we still have yet to recognize. Fundamental laws, people. I'm going to get it right this time and list the right not to be owned by another human as a fundamental law of peaceful self-governing, and it must be listed. In addition, the main purpose of the 9th Amendment and the rest of the Bill of Rights is to, quote-unquote, instill faith in the government, as stated in the preamble. So how much faith can I have as an African American if the supreme law of the land expressly grants a right to own blacks? And how much faith can I have as an African American if the same group of white legislators who ratified the 13th Amendment can just as easily ratify another amendment that says it is okay to own blacks after all? There's no faith at all. I would spend the rest of my life voting legislators into Congress and into state legislators on the sole basis of them being black, since that is my only source of protection from this document called the Constitution that is supposedly meant to protect me. If the people do not have faith in the government as instilled by the Constitution, the whole constitutional contract crumbles. This is the main point. Our fundamental human rights that are still waiting to be recognized by the Supreme Court as fully protected 9th Amendment rights, other than the right not to be owned by another human, and I've listed a few more, I think I could add to this too, are 1, the right not to be killed by another human in cold blood, especially if that human is working as an agent of the government. We should strike down capital punishment, period. You have a right not to be murdered by anybody, especially the government, in cold blood. So that means no capital punishment. God, come on, people. Trump especially. They did this on purpose, by the way. It wasn't him, but the Nazis and the Republican Party, with their bloodthirsty gay Nazi pieces of shit, reinstated capital punishment at the federal level. And Trump just had to go along with it. It's probably the one thing that's going to prevent him from having immortality is this one thing. I told him that. And it's just, he needs to end it. But, he had his hands tied, I'm pretty sure. Pretty sure it's one thing he does not favor. We'll see. I hope not. Because then he's not the person that I think he is. The right not to be hit by another human at any age, including under the auspices of being disciplined by a guardian. It's the number one problem for blacks. They need to stop hitting their kids, period. I'm not even going to I have entire other things written on this. These are family rights in family court, which is the last thing that's going to be done, unfortunately, because the gay Nazis obliterate the family with their freaking laws, and especially the black family. The black family is most obliterated by the gay Nazi family court laws, including they don't protect the right not to be hit by another human. 3, the right to 50% legal and 50% physical custody of a biological child. That's a fundamental right, and I listed that one out as well in great detail in filing an appeal to the Supreme Court. It's already listed all out, which they rejected, of course, immediately. They just ignored it, of course, because they're idiots. And it's not they're idiots, it's just they don't have the power to do any of this stuff, because in order to get to the biggest swamp of all is the family court laws, which is what started all of this. Is family court with me. I'm doing all of this to get to these rights, and we can't get there until we take down the 16th Amendment. So the 16th Amendment falls, all this stuff naturally starts to fall out. All these other rights start to fall into place, but the 16th Amendment is their power, their money source. Once you take away their money source, which is what's happening now, the swamps start to fall, and then we could be logical. Because every single evidence, you want evidence up the gazoo on spanking children, we have it. It's not like, we have to go out and do studies to figure this out. We know, and every psychologist and psychiatrist knows this is a really bad idea, and it's the number one cause of stress and early death and everything else. All your freaking medical, all this stuff Okay, you're going to live longer like the Asians because they don't spank if you don't spank. And it's not to say no discipline. That's discipline. Spanking is not discipline. They're two different things. Discipline means to teach, and you're not teaching when you're spanking. Okay, you're breaking the kid. Because the right that is being protected is the right to learn self-discipline. And you cannot learn self-discipline if you're spanked. And you have a right. Every human has a right to learn self-discipline as a young child. In other words, the right to make mistakes and the right to learn from those mistakes and to learn self-discipline. That will stick with you for the rest of your life. And the right to serve on a jury once randomly selected out of the population, i.e. no voir dire allowed, at least not as practiced modernly. Could have sworn I had other rights listed in here. Oh, yeah, because of the pandemic. It's the right to informed consent. This caused the pandemic, I'm pretty sure, or at least it helped it come along, because I submitted this for publication in November of 2019. And then things were coming to a head as it was, but I think this probably catalyzed that a little bit. So new rights that came out of the pandemic are, there's a few of them listed that aren't listed here. This is just the original from 3 years ago. I haven't refined this one. Another thing I would change a little bit is to say that Marbury versus Madison
did not
establish the power of judicial review. I think it's in the First Amendment. First Amendment right to petition the government for grievances. When you petition the government, you file a lawsuit, and that's in the judicial branch. And the people who have the final say over decisions in the judicial branch is the Supreme Court. So it's in the First Amendment right to petition the government that judicial review, if I have a complaint about a law, which is what the First Amendment is all about, the right to petition the government is a complaint that a law is unconstitutional. Where am I going to petition that? I'm going to petition that. I'm going to file a lawsuit petition in court, and the people who run the court ultimately is the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court has judicial review over my First Amendment right to argue against the government laws. So judicial review is in the Constitution. It is expressly, well, maybe it's not completely expressly, but it's much more so than the Nazis have made out. 1:55, I gotta go. Everything's gonna be okay. Oh, cat, look at this. This is what he does. Now he knows I gotta go. I gotta go, cat. Everything's gonna be okay, everybody. Hang in there. Living my best life for sure. And Godspeed to everybody coming out the other side in one piece. PEACE. I'm gonna pick this right up later. Bye. Hello, everybody. Happy Monday, December 12th, 2022. It's actually almost 24 hours since the last time I was on here. It's almost midnight, so it's the other end. Without much further ado, the interesting thing is, just while we're here, for the longest time I was the only one viewing anything on my site, apparently, according to YouTube. And all of a sudden, this last week, I'm getting all sorts of views on everything. So either I'm getting a lot of interest in this stuff, or YouTube is telling the truth about my views. Anyway, this is my YouTube site. I work at Target. I unload the trucks and I stock the shelves. On my homepage, you go to my About page. And down below, there's all these links. And what I'm reading right now, I'm going to finish reading
Dred Scott.
We're going to go to the 16th Amendment must fall. It's the number one goal. It's the number one thing I think Trump is trying to achieve. And this is the last part of it. And I'm going to finish this right now. The music of the night. The first part of this was exposing the fraud, positive implications. I know I have to go down to the 14th Amendment. So I'm going through the amendments briefly to show which ones are constitutional and which ones are not, and which ones need to be removed. 13th was the last one I covered. And now I'm going to go to the 14th. Okay. So here we go. Using my criteria, which are the amendment can neither create nor destroy power. If it does, it must be struck down as unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. And the other one is if it's frivolous. In other words, can an act of Congress achieve the same goal? Then it shouldn't be an amendment. It should be an act of Congress. The amendment process is being abused by power-hungry assholes, which is the same as politician. Politicians and lawyers are all assholes. You know, once we have that initial assumption, as the framers did, politicians and lawyers
are all assholes?
We can get along, actually. And it's the same with racists. Everybody's trying to make a law saying you can't be racist. You can be whatever the hell you want. It's not illegal to be racist. It's not illegal to be homophobic, which is all subjective anyway. You call anybody a racist. Just for being white, you can call them a racist. It's so stupid, these labels and names and everything. They're completely powerless. And somebody says this. Who is it? Is it Kanye? Powerful black people say, you can be racist all you want. If you have money, who cares? I'm just saying, it doesn't matter if somebody's racist. Let them be racist over there in the corner, as long as they don't have power over your rights. So once you get rid of the 16th Amendment, once the rights are protected, racism doesn't matter. So what if somebody's racist? Big deal. The reason everybody's having fits over homophobia and racism and everything is it implies the person who is racist and homophobic and a misogynist and all this has power over your life, over your rights. Okay, if they don't have power over your rights, who cares? The racism will never go away. Homophobia will never go away. These things will never go away. But what will go away is these people having power over your rights once you take down the 16th Amendment. So let people be these things. Just take away their power to have any kind of influence over your life. That's what we're doing. So we're never going to get rid of racism. So just stop talking about it and talk about taking down the 16th Amendment. All right, I'm just tired of that shit. It's actually what is being used to prevent you from getting rid of this stuff. The Nazis have been doing this since the mutation came into being. It's all coming to a head right now. If somebody says you're a racist, you're homophobic, or I don't want to vote for Trump because he's a racist, these are telltale signs, by the way. I give you some red flags. If it comes out of a politician's mouth or a news person's mouth or anybody else's mouth, the person is either a gay Nazi asshole or it's a non-gay dumbass moron who is controlled by the gay Nazi assholes. And the goal for me here is to educate the non-gay dumbass morons to not be non-gay dumbass morons. Okay, Amendment 14, and it's not up for vote. Birthright citizenship is unconstitutional because it destroys the exclusive power of Congress to naturalize babies born on U.S. soil to non-U.S. citizens. Only babies born on U.S. soil to at least one parent who is a U.S. citizen are allowed birthright citizenship under the Constitution, the original Constitution. Because at the time of the framing of the Constitution, babies born on U.S. soil to non-U.S. citizens were considered foreigners unless they were naturalized by Congress. Specifically, Justice Daniel, in his concurring opinion in Dred Scott, quotes Vittel in his treatise on law of nations, and this is what he writes. I say, to be of the country, it is necessary to be born of a person who is a citizen. For if he be born there of a foreigner, it will be only the place of his birth and not his country. The inhabitants, as distinguished from citizens, are foreigners who are permitted to settle and stay in the country. And there's the citation for that one. The rest of the amendment of the 14th Amendment is unconstitutional for being frivolous. Okay, so I'm striking down the 14th Amendment in two different parts. The first part, the birthright citizenship, that's struck down because that's creating a right or taking away a right to one of the contract parties. The rest of the amendment is going to be struck down for being frivolous because all parties, including state legislatures, are bound by the Bill of Rights. And the 14th Amendment is making a statement. It's like the 13th Amendment. It's interpreting the Constitution incorrectly, starting out. For well over a century, both federal and state governments have been negligently arresting people at will without a reasonable arrest warrant issued by a grand jury in violation of the Fourth Amendment. But then, unlike the federal government, most state governments go on to charge these negligently arrested people, who are disproportionately black, with felonies without a grand jury indictment in violation of the Fifth Amendment, trying to base the 14th Amendment on Barron versus Baltimore instead of relying on the wisdom of Corfield versus Coriel, and I give citations, is almost as big of a mistake as trying to base anything on Dred Scott v. Sanford with a D. Barron versus Baltimore is similarly a fraudulently modified case, or more likely a fraudulent creation cut entirely from whole cloth, rife with conclusionary statements and illogical arguments that are obviously not penned by Chief Justice Marshall, and that similarly mysteriously has a title that differs from the name of the litigant. The official title of the original case on file at the Library of Congress is Barron with one R, when the plaintiff's name is actually Barron with two R's. The 14th Amendment is unconstitutional for changing a material term by creating a right not in the original Constitution, which is the birthright citizenship, and for the rest being frivolous. The stuff I'm discussing here is criminal law changes. And I hate when people say go to another site, but seriously, the site to look at is rightsforfamilies.wordpress.com. There was a grant proposal that I wrote that really, in excruciating detail, goes through all the changes that must be made to the criminal justice system, where we actually follow the Constitution. We've gone so far off track. It's amazing. I mean, it's so bad. We have to get rid of the 16th Amendment because it's all money that's keeping this stuff in place. It's all corrupt money that's keeping it in place. And once we get rid of that money source and the 16th Amendment falls, all this stuff is just going to come gushing in until the justice system is run properly. Anyway, let's go on here. It is fair to ask, where is the equality clause in the Constitution without the 14th Amendment? So that's the other thing, is the 14th Amendment this is the argument. The original Bill of Rights doesn't apply to the states. Can you imagine? Who the hell? It's the stupidest statement on the planet. So once again, here's another thing. To those of you out there who aren't in law, if a news person or an expert on constitutional law, a Supreme Court justice, anybody makes this statement, it goes like this. The Bill of Rights does not apply to the states, only to the federal government. If they make that statement, they are either a gay Nazi asshole or a non-gay dumbass moron, and it's just not to be believed. It's just fake news. The Bill of Rights, absolutely, in the original Constitution, applies to the state governments as well. And it's not just guessing. It's written in several places, and I have all the arguments for that. So we don't need the 14th Amendment to state that because it's already there in the original Constitution. And the other thing people say we needed the 14th Amendment because there was no equality clauses in the original Constitution. They didn't say people had to be equal there. Anyway, it is fair to ask, where is the equality clause in the Constitution without the 14th Amendment? Well, it is. As alluded to above, the equality clauses, there are two. There are actually four, but the equality clauses state that no citizen can be targeted to be treated better than any other citizen. No titles of nobility that give only one class the right to vote and the right to own property. So when you say no titles of nobility, that means you can't have a noble class. And the noble class in England means only nobility have the right to vote and own property. Only nobility can do that. So no titles of nobility, not just the title. When they say no titles of nobility, they're not talking about just the title, sir, and this and that. You call anybody whatever you want. They're talking about nobility in general, meaning you can't say certain people can vote and certain people can't. Everybody gets these rights. Okay, so it's equality. And the other one is no citizen can be targeted, be treated worse than any others, which is no bills of attainder, stating blacks can be punished just for being black, etc. That's an example. Together, these clauses make up the equality clause. Oh, there goes the cops. I used to be really apprehensive every time I see a police officer, but I've changed my mind since being here in Burbank and in LA. Especially, they come by and they ask me if I'm okay sometimes. I get the feeling they're protecting me more than anything. I mean, I'm always, after you've been falsely arrested 5 times, it becomes... almost like PTSD every time you see a police officer or anytime there's a knock on your door. But lately, I'm glad for it. I hope that's you, Trump. I hope that's you, boss man. In The Art of the Deal, which I read a long time ago, I was really impressed by him decades ago because I just happened to, my mom always had these books that she would get at garage sales and things. And randomly, she wasn't a big book person, but she kind of was in a way where they would just be randomly on her shelf. And, I got bored one time or whatever, and I just picked it off the shelf. And one of them was The Art of the Deal. And I didn't search it out. I didn't say, oh, I like that Trump and go buy it. It was just on my mom's bookshelf. And I didn't even know the name Trump at the time. I just saw this, whatever, Trump, and read it. And it was great. It's just like contract law. I loved it. In The Art of the Deal, he says, when you go into a deal, you have to figure out before you get into the deal what you want versus what you need. And I told Trump, look, I'm not asking for much in life. I'm doing all this stuff. I'm giving, I'm helping you out, I think. I call him boss man, and I try to help him out. I think I'm Hamilton and he's Washington. I'm his best advisor. I came back as me and he came back as him. because my birthday is the same as Hamilton, but his birthday isn't the same as Washington. His birthday is the same as my gay baby daddy, which cracks me up. That cracks me up more than anything. I call that dead people humor. I'm just saying Trump to Trump. I said this a long time ago. This is what I need. I don't need anything else in life except, please, I don't want to be arrested again. Like, seriously. I could deal with it, because you have to deal with it. But I just really, really, really don't want to be arrested. If the dead people want me arrested, I'm going to be, regardless of what Trump does. If they don't want me arrested, I'm not going to be arrested regardless of what Trump does. But there are some things in life that are arbitrary to them, I believe. I believe some things they could give or take and they don't care. There are some things that have to be done and some things that don't have to be done. But in this case, if it's arbitrary, I'm asking Trump, if you have any freaking power, an ounce of it, just make sure. And I'm not talking about I'm arrested and then I get out of jail. I'm saying don't have a fucking cop put another fucking handcuff on me. Okay? Ever again. I'm not going to break any laws. I'm not doing anything illegal under the Constitution. Let's just put it that way. As long as I'm not doing anything illegal under the original Constitution, don't have me freaking arrested. And I'm never going to do anything that isn't under the original Constitution. Okay? Just I don't want to be arrested again. Just make that happen. That's what I need in any deal. And you say, well, what is the deal at my end? The deal at my end is I'm not going to be pissed off at you for the next 1,000 years. Okay? Okay? And I'm going to be instead loyal to you. Do you get it? Okay. That's all. I don't know what else to say. I have nothing to give him in return except my loyalty. And that's very important to him. That's the most important thing to him, actually. So, yeah. So don't have me arrested. And that's why the cop went by. Okay, so I still have a little bit of apprehension because I'm not sure, but it's a lot lower in that I'm starting more to view them as protectors. When they start driving by, I start to think, thank you, you're here protecting me specifically. Like, not just me as I think they know about me and they're here to protect me from other people, I think. I just get that feeling. There was a cop that came by while I was brushing my teeth in the Target parking lot, and I thought, this is it. They're coming to arrest me. And he was the nicest LAPD. It was like, it gave me complete more faith in the cops, but he was like, there's a certain way cops talk to you, and you can tell they're fucking Nazi assholes. Most cops are gay Nazi assholes, and you could tell from the way they talk to you. But this guy was like, LAPD, you need to hire them. Actually, he's going to be hired by CHP. Most of the best cops at the local level go up to the state level. State troopers and state cops, I find, are way better than local police. I think they're screened for being the better cops. Because I found CHP and the state troopers and as a trucker were just way better level of cops. Okay, to me, that's just my own experience. But maybe other people, of course, blacks will have a different experience possibly. But mostly, if you're having a bad experience, it's a gay cop. Just letting you know, black people. It's a gay white Nazi asshole usually. Or a non-gay dumbass moron influenced by them. Or they were definitely spanked as kids. But anyway, I'm just saying, the cop came by and I had a mouthful of toothpaste. And I just started spitting it out and I felt embarrassed. But he says, I'm just checking on you. You okay? He says, you sleep in the car here? And I say, well, I don't want to say that because I'm not sure if it's legal or not. But they know where I sleep just before work over there. But he was just very nice. And I felt like more protected by him than him coming to arrest me or something. I felt protected. That was a very positive contact with LAPD. I'm really glad to be doing this, reading this stuff like this, because I do have these little stories that I just never told anybody anywhere or wrote it anywhere. And I just want it to come out somewhere, that I had a very positive experience with a contact with LAPD. Another one was Burbank or LA when my car conked out. That was a black guy, though. Most minority cops I have no problem with. They're fantastic. If they're minority and they come, it's the white cops that I have a little bit of apprehension with. And this was a white cop who came and talked to me over at the Target parking lot. And since then, I always see them drive by, and I always feel more protected by them when I'm over there than the other way. Okay, so thank you for that, for the good cops. And to the minority, there was a black cop that came by and helped me when my battery died in the middle of the street. It was sweet as hell. Not that they're all okay, because when I was in jail, there were some minority deputies that really had problems with white people. And I don't have white guilt anymore, so now I'm like, enough of that shit. And one of them, I think eventually she kind of retired because of some of the stuff she did with me that I complained about. And I think I eventually had her implode a little bit. But she really hated whites, and it was just like, I don't know. It happens, people. And I used to take that because I had white guilt, and I don't have white guilt anymore. So, and neither does Trump. It cracks me up because a lot of people call him racist in this, and he's like one of the least racist white people, if you can recognize it, because he doesn't have white guilt. A lot of people, if they're called racist, they take it to heart, and that shows they really are racist. It's a funny ploy, people. White people out there, if you feel like there's some minority people calling you racist or whatever, and you kind of bend over, you have white guilt, and that means you are racist. Just don't do it. Actually, it's the same with parents. Like, my mom would do this all the time. We try to make her feel things. She says, I'm doing my best. She would not take it. And you know what? It made us feel, as kids, it made us feel more secure. When she would call you on your bullshit, like you would accuse her of something and she would just not take it at all. And whether she was guilty of it or not, but in a way it made you feel secure. Like you would say, okay, that's fine. Then she really isn't, or you at least feel secure about it. But if a parent acquiesces to it or tries to cater to that, then you say, oh, I did hit something, didn't I? And it makes you feel insecure. Anyway, it just reject it. You have what, and I did, and I understand. I was woke. I had the white guilt. I went through this shit, and not anymore. It's just like, screw you. You don't have no problems if you really aren't. I mean, everybody is racist. That's what you say. You just say everybody's racist. Because I've been a minority enough amongst Hispanics who are not. I mean, it exists, but not strongly with them, and amongst blacks, to know that it can be used. And good for them when they use white guilt to their advantage. That's fine. Just do it. That's fine. It's just you can't do it on me anymore. So Trump is not racist. He sees green. He doesn't see white. He doesn't see black. He doesn't see Hispanic. He doesn't see anything. He just sees green, which is fantastic. That's what a capitalist world is. Okay, it doesn't see any colors. It just sees green, and everybody balks at that. Oh, the greedy, whatever. No, that's the fairest way to get things done. It's the most fair society of all. Is not the way it is now under corruption, which capitalism gets a bad name, and a lot of Nazis are trying to. There's Jimmy Dore and Russell Brand are the two big ones. They are put in place by the Nazis to make sure that they'll give up some of the facts right now. They're trying to get Trump people and people who are uncovering everything that I'm talking about. They're trying to channel them to make sure the 16th Amendment doesn't come down because they think capitalism is bad. Capitalism is not bad as used in the true capitalist sense. They're trying to make sure that Trump doesn't come into power and that capitalism is bad, and they want their socialist this and socialist that. Because, no, socialism bad, people. All of it. It's all fascism. Okay. It is fair to ask, where is the equality clause? There are this. Together, these clauses make up... Okay. Together, these clauses make up the equality clause. And interestingly enough, if all the restrictions placed on the federal government in Article 1, Sections 9... There are at least 10 of the restrictions. And all of the restrictions placed on the state governments in Article 1, Section 10, there are at least 18 restrictions. List them all out. They're listed side by side for comparisons. It becomes clear that the only restrictions included on both lists, in other words, the only restrictions placed on both the federal and state governments are 1, no ex post facto laws, no bills of attainder, and no titles of nobility. Okay, so what falls out of this are these three restrictions also happen to be the only personal privileges listed on both lists. Meaning the only three restrictions to make both lists are also the only personal privileges covered on both lists. In effect, this is the Bill of Rights of the first 7 articles, including both equality clauses. And it is obvious that the framers intended for any and all personal privileges, including those in the Bill of Rights that came later, to bind both the state governments as well as the federal government in this contract. It's been clear from the beginning. And in fact, it's so clear, it's like the framers didn't even write that part of it. It's so clear. And yet, this is where the Nazis come in. They say, oh, it's not there, it's not written. It is there. It's just, that's right there. This is also clear in the preamble to the Bill of Rights, which mentions the government, the general term used for both the state and federal governments in the Constitution. Anytime the Constitution says the government like that in capital letters, they mean both state and federal. It's used that way throughout the Constitution instead of the United States government. And that's the term the Constitution uses when it means the federal government. Okay, the general term used in the Constitution, it's just clear. There's no ambiguity in this. It's language. There's more evidence. So when in the Bill of Rights, it says we're binding the government, not the United States government. So the Bill of Rights does apply to both the state and federal government, period. There is more evidence, but this is probably the subject of another law review article titled, I've covered this in my websites. And I hate sending you there, but it's there. Titled, Understanding the Great Barron Fraud of 1833 Helps to Restore the Supreme Court's Full Authority to Strike Down the 14th Amendment as Unconstitutional. There's plenty of arguments out there. And it's not going to be discussed here any further. It's all out there, people. The 14th Amendment needs to go. It's just a big piece of shit. It's just another Nazi tool. They're just leading up to the 16th Amendment, but it's just another one that needs to go. Amendment 15 is frivolous because this amendment, granting blacks the right to vote, can be achieved by an act of Congress. There is absolutely nothing in the Constitution that requires an amendment. Okay? There's not, and right now the ERA, we need the right to vote. The amendment that gave women the right to vote needs to go too. And everybody's going to say, oh, that takes away the right to vote. No, it doesn't, because there's nothing in the Constitution, the original Constitution, that says women can't vote or blacks can't vote. There's nothing there that says that. You just need to pass a law of Congress to do that. And they're just too chicken shit to do that. The Nazis are giving you the impression that you can't do a shit without the amendments. And once the amendment is there, if you take them down, you're a racist or you're a misogynist and all this bullshit. It's just bullshit. Amendment 16. This is by far the amendment in most dire need of judicial review because this amendment, without a doubt, strikes hard at a material term of the constitutional contract. In fact, you can say by the placement of this material term at Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3, at the very beginning of the contract, after formalities, that this is perhaps the most material term in the entire contract, stating, quote, representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states. And it goes on a little bit, but this is the crux of it. And the reason I cut it off there is because there are 11, and that's a lucky number. These 11 words, which were modified and bandied about for quite some time until the framers finally settled upon them. The framers managed to intertwine and sum up the essence of a capitalistic Republican democracy in one highly distilled statement, like a fundamental law of human nature. The best description of the history, purpose, and meaning of this phrase, and the 4 other similar phrases placing specific restrictions on federal taxing powers, is described in the majority opinion of Chief Justice Melville Fuller in Pollock versus Farmers Loan and Trust Company, 1895. Probably the 3rd best written opinion in Supreme Court history after Marbury versus Madison and Dred Scott versus Sanford. Whenever the Supreme Court strikes down an act of Congress in the past, and it was really important, and it was Marbury versus Madison was the first one, and the second one was Dred Scott, and the third one was this Chief Justice Fuller and Pollock. He did an excellent job of striking down direct taxation. Just fantastic, the way he completely annihilated it. The Nazis come up with an amendment to the Constitution to overthrow the Supreme Court decision, and they can't do that. When the Supreme Court says it, that's it. It's final. You can't make an amendment to the Constitution to overthrow a ruling of the Supreme Court, which is what they've been doing. That's what the 16th Amendment did. The 16th Amendment was made to overrule Justice Melville Fuller on this, and you can't do that. And that's why the 16th Amendment was come down. But I was trying to make this point at Wikipedia, and I just gave up. I gave up on Wikipedia a long time ago. Wikipedia is fantastic, like YouTube is fantastic. All these things, YouTube, Wikipedia, they're a fantastic potential source of information. But of course, since it's a fantastic source of information, it's been taken over by the gay Nazi assholes. But they're eventually going to run out of money and have to do it right. And they are. They're like, and now they're begging for money. We can't do anything without your money. Well, suck a dick, you fucking Nazis. I'm not sending you a dime. You're going to have to, let people actually put facts up there at Wikipedia. And they're very good at giving you a broad view of things, but on the important stuff, they're shit. I'm saying the Wikipedia page on this is bad. I'm saying Cornell University has put up an incorrect. Like, if you're trying to get to this case online, make sure you go to LexisNexis or you do something, because you can't get to the actual case anymore. You can't get the original case online. What they'll put up is not the real case. So be very careful, you guys out there, when you're trying to find the real case that I'm talking about as being the third best written. I'm talking about the case that I saw online when I briefed it. And I have the brief, and it shows that the brief isn't anything. I mean, I don't know what they did. It was like a shortened version of it that cuts out all the good stuff. I don't know what's on there. There's just funny business going on. So on that one, definitely go to the originals if you can. On either, maybe it's changed on LexisNexis too. Who knows? But the original case, and maybe it's changed all the way back to the Library of Congress. It could go that far, because who knows? I mean, the gay Nazis were able to change an entire Supreme Court opinion that we still have, alter it, and it's in our files as the actual opinion. So who knows what they're capable of right now when it comes. So this is what I want the historic, the forensic historians to come back and undo this shit, if that's what happened. Okay, so the best description of history, purpose, and meaning of this phrase, and the 4 other similar phrases placing specific restrictions on federal taxing powers, is best described in the majority opinion of Chief Justice Melville Fuller in Pollock versus Farmers Loan and Trust Company. Okay, go get the original somehow, or make sure you get the original. And I'll try to post my brief of it if I could find it again. Thank God I did that, because I lost everything else. I think I posted it on Twitter, and Twitter came down. So that might be a problem. That might be problematic unless Elon gives me back my Twitter, which he better. Otherwise, he's just another fucking Nazi who hails from the defense contractor swamp. Just keep that in mind about Elon. He's looking like he's doing fine, but it's an indication, if he doesn't let me have my Twitter back, that he's from the defense contractor swamp. Probably the third best written opinion on Supreme Court history, after Marbury versus Madison and Dred Scott versus Sanford. When this restriction on federal taxation is linked to a restriction on federal representation, and both are based on the same population metric in such a brilliant way, hence honoring the dictum, there should never be taxation without representation in a national government. It's not only a dictum. I've since said, I called it a dictum here 3 years ago. Now I call it a fundamental right. It becomes evident that this phrase is the fundamental law of human nature, equivalent of E equals MC squared in physics. It's just a fundamental right. And just in case it was not clear to the guardians of the Constitution on the Supreme Court, from the placement alone of this fundamental law at the very beginning of the contract, the framers not only went on to mention this federal tax restriction later in Article 1, Section 9, Clause 4, stating, quote, "No capitation or other direct tax shall be laid unless in proportion to the census." That's the same thing. They say it again. But they practically enshrined it in stone, at least as much as possible, using words alone, by making sure this restriction on federal taxation was not altered in any manner, big or small, in Article 5, stating, as described above, that the government may amend the Constitution, provided that no amendment which may be made prior to the year 1808 shall in any manner affect this first and fourth clauses in the 9th section of the first article. Okay, this clause therefore becomes the only clause in the Constitution that is flagged 3 times by the framers as important. It is hard to imagine anything being more material than that. So the interesting thing is this. The
1808
thing, they only said the Constitution can't be changed until
1808
on 2 different things. And the 2 things were no direct taxation by the federal government unless apportioned. And the other thing was they weren't allowed to make the slave trade illegal. Isn't that hilarious? It just shows you Trump knows this, the art of the deal. Here we are trying to ratify this Constitution. There's deal making going on. And the fucking Nazis know inherently. Gay Nazi assholes aren't stupid. They're very bright, actually. The gay gene makes people brighter. I think gays are brighter than non-gays. But unfortunately, some gays have been using that in a bad way instead of in a good way. In Hollywood, they make it in a good way with their drama, and they're very bright and brilliant and creative until they use it in a bad way. Okay, so gays, that's why Trump has a lot of bright gay people around him, including Alexander Hamilton, who was gay. All right? So gays can be very bright, but they knew, and you could see it, you could just see what's going on. Dear forensic historians, check out the deal going on just to get this thing ratified. You had to make a deal with the devil. The fucking gay Nazi assholes at the time would not allow this to happen. They were fighting hard against the Constitution, against this clause. They were fighting hard against this taxation clause because they knew that that was a fundamental right. And they just did not want that. They needed socialism. They needed the money. The money was the key. They said, okay, we'll let you have that. But in exchange, you got to let us keep slavery. Can you imagine that? This is the deal the framers had to make. But the framers were very smart, and they put in the Ninth Amendment. They did everything they could. You could tell. Dear black people, okay, just give it a chance. Give white people a chance. For God's sakes. Stop spanking your kids. I mean, I'm just telling you, there were champions trying to get rid of slavery a long time ago. A lot of people, I would say a majority of people at the time were trying to get rid of slavery. It's just a very small minority of very powerful, very asshole, very aggressive gay white Nazis that just they're still doing it now. And guess what? They're controlling you. And, Mr. What's his name? Mr. Tobacco, Mr. Obama Tobacco. They're doing it through the tobacco masters. You better believe Mr. Obama, President Obama, has his tobacco slave masters. For sure. Still controlling him. He's still a slave. Article 5. No amendment may be made prior to the year 1808 in any manner affects the first and the fourth clauses of the 9th section of this first article. And the first and fourth clauses have to do with slavery and the taxation. They were pitted against each other. That was the deal. To get this damn thing ratified, we had to make a deal with the devil. And the deal with the devil was, we'll let you keep your slavery, but you can't change this clause on the taxation. And they were hoping by that point that the Supreme Court would come in. And they did. Marbury versus Madison. Yeah. It came in, and they were doing great. But we lost out in the Great Dred Scott Fraud. And we lost out, people. The gay Nazi assholes won that one. It's okay. Anyway, it's a material term. The taxation was very important, is what I'm saying. And yet the 16th Amendment comes along in 1913 and swings a huge, heavy-handed wrecking ball at that brilliant 11-word equation stating, quote, the Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes on incomes from whatever source derived, without apportionment among the several states, and without regard to any census or enumeration. And nobody says anything about it. Nobody said a thing, hardly. This is most likely because the disastrous Great Dred Scott Fraud of 1857 had so thoroughly crippled the Supreme Court's reputation and the Supreme Court's power of judicial review over anything, especially constitutional amendments, that when the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments came along, all repugnant to the Constitution, yet all purposely designed to pretend to be against slavery and in favor of blacks, two subjects over which the Supreme Court lost most of its credibility in 1857. The Supreme Court had no choice but to allow these attacks on the U.S. Constitution and attacks on all Americans, especially African Americans, to stand without a challenge, thereby setting a very dangerous precedent by the time the most repugnant of all the amendments, Amendment 16, came along. This precedent is erroneously and dangerously followed to this day. What they established under the 13th and the 14th and then the 15th and the 16th They were trying to establish that the Supreme Court has no power to review the amendments. And they do. So let's do it. Trump's going to help you do it. Trump knows, though. I think he's trying to do it through Congress, or he's going to do it through both. The disastrous effects of the 16th Amendment, like the disastrous effects of the Great Dred Scott Fraud of 1857, were immediate, catastrophic, and long-lasting, as is evident from a graph of the U.S. government revenue from 1790 to 2015, showing that in 1910, just prior to ratification of the 16th Amendment, U.S. government revenue from unapportioned direct taxes, which are very harmful taxes that will create major power imbalances and government corruption, according to the framers, was practically non-existent, with the federal government relying, as intended, mostly on excise taxes, which is taxes on alcohol and tobacco, for instance, tariffs, which are duty taxes, and land sales. Soon after ratification of the 16th Amendment, however, there was a giant spike in unapportioned direct taxes, in other words, personal and corporate income taxes, that immediately made up over 80% of U.S. government revenue within a year or two of the ratification of the 16th Amendment, and with few exceptions has remained as high or higher to this day, where these taxes now make up over 90% of U.S. government revenue. So it was easy money that could be spent any way Congress wants. What the fuck do you think is going to happen when you put in the 16th Amendment and take out this clause? You get corruption up the gazoo. Look at this. It's from, and I'll show you the website it's from, but here is in 1910, what is purple and yellow are tariffs and consumption taxes, which is sales taxes, which is the best way to collect taxes on people because it really taxes the rich. If you buy a yacht, you're going to pay a huge amount of taxes. But if you buy food, you don't get taxed at all. Because the other thing is on sales taxes, you notice there's no sales tax on food. There's no sales tax allowed on stuff that's a necessity. All right? So you should be able to live without paying any taxes to the federal government at all, if you choose. But here's the graph that it happened in 1910. Here comes the 16th Amendment, and boom, everything is now income taxes. Income taxes, the red. And blue, Social Security is also an income tax. You're going to say, well, you need Social Security. Well, not by force. There's other things that could come in play. This is just very corrupt. This should be paid in state taxes. If you want the income tax, it should be paid by the states, not by people's income. Anyway, this deep purple should be most of it excise taxes. And also, what is the yellow? Tariffs. This should be like this. See the purple, the deep purple and the yellow in 1910 with very little other stuff? That should be 80%. This should be 90% of the federal government income. Trump is working on the tariffs part, making that a lot bigger. And see this little line right here? So he doesn't say how much was in the Treasury. Like, he collected a shitload. And I think the stuff he collected before the pandemic, the fake pandemic, I think the stuff he collected was enough to get us through the pandemic. He collected so much money from China on tariffs. He says tens of billions, but it could have been hundreds of billions. And that's what they're spending now. But I think that's what kept us going through. Like, you can't shut down the economy like that. Sorry, everybody. But something happened that was not quite, it was off in a good way. It was like we shut down the economy for a year or two, and we sort of came out relatively unscathed. Where does all that money come from? I think the money came from, it was all that stuff that he had up. I'm just saying, man, once you get rid of the corporate income tax, the way he did, he lowered it. And once you start relying on this stuff, so much money is going to come in, and it's going to be non-corrupting. It's going to be incorrupt the way it's spent too. We had to spend it all on Pfizer bullshit, but it's going to be. It's amazing the changes that are going to be made in inevitable world peace. Okay, you'll see. It's going to happen in our lifetimes, I'm pretty sure. Anyway, this result is to be expected and was expected by the framers, considering granting Congress unchecked power to take all the money it wants from any American it wants without any linkage to apportionment or representation is going to be like giving Congress permission to take all the candy it wants from a candy store without personal or professional repercussions. It is proposed the corruption brought on by the 16th Amendment alone affected the entire world, with copious amounts of easy money from unprotected U.S. taxpayers being funneled through Congress and into corrupt hands at home and abroad in order to fund both sides of World War I, both sides of World War II, including helping to fund Hitler and his Jewish Holocaust, and both sides of every war since. This deep corruption most likely also brought on the Great Depression and every other economic ill since. While unchecked capitalism is often blamed for the Great Depression, the fact is true capitalism has not existed in this country since 1913, and it is in reality unchecked, unapportioned direct taxes by the federal government that is most likely to blame. If it has not become clear yet to anybody but President Donald Trump, who is making valiant efforts to wean the U.S. government off of unapportioned direct taxes and have the federal government instead go back to relying on pre-16th Amendment excise taxes and tariffs, it will soon become clear to many that the 16th Amendment is a cancer on the entire world that must be removed. The sooner the better. It is unlikely Congress will voluntarily give up its self-granted power to tax all it wants, as has been most evident from the behavior of Congress since President Trump was elected, and has become a number one enemy of Congress, both parties, as well as of the mainstream media, both of which benefit heavily from the corrupt flow of illegally collected federal income taxes. So it will be up to the one entity with the will and the power to protect the Constitution, with full authority of judicial review over constitutional amendments, to do it. And soon it is hoped. So, this is where I'm wrong. I just get the feeling that Trump is going to try to use Congress. He's building his Congress slowly but surely. And when I say building his Congress, it's both Republicans and Democrats. I don't think he cares if it's a Republican or a Democrat. I don't think anybody who won in the last election, whether they're Democrats or Republicans, won against his will. I think he's forming a Congress so that when he comes in 2024 with the candidates he wants in place, he's going to use Congress to take down the 16th Amendment, or a Congress in conjunction with the Supreme Court, which he's also kind of building in a way. So it's going to take both of these things together, and then he'll drop the bomb. That's probably why I can't get this thing published, because it's a little too soon. It's a little too early to drop this bomb. So he has a plan in place possibly, but I hope this can get published in some way. I don't mean to put a wrench in whatever plans he has, but I don't have full faith that that's his plan. I'm not sure. I don't trust anybody but facts. Okay. So, and I don't trust anybody who represses facts for any reason. And then here's the case brief. I already read all that. Anyway, let's just get done with this. This is long. So I'm going to publish this. This is going to be Music of the Night, Media Swamp Stock Tutorial Part 9. And then after this, probably later today or even tonight, I think I'm going to go right into it. The next one, Part 10, I'm going to read my most recent lawsuit that I filed here in Central District of California, which is in federal court. It's called Young versus Garcetti, concerning the mandates and things like that. I filed that last March 9th. And then after I get done with that, the last part of this series is going to be part 11. I like that because it turns out to be 11. If it comes close to being an 11, I will force it into that. So it will be 11, but it's coming out to be naturally number 11. Number 11, I'm going to read something I'm trying to get published about COVID-19. I explain the entire, I don't know if I could say that here. I've said it before, though, and it didn't get knocked down. But fake pandemic. And if I'm going to be suspended or taken down from YouTube entirely, it's going to be number 11. So you might not hear number 11. But you see it linked. Well, whatever. I mean, whatever. Who knows? It's linked, and if it comes down, I'll go to Twitter, and if not, I'll be at Truth Social. And that's that. Okay, so everything's going to be okay, everybody. Hang in there. Living my best life. It's really fun. I think you could see now why it's so much fun doing all this stuff. And I hope everybody gets out the other side in one piece, Peace. Bye. Talk to you soon.